So I've been a park ranger for almost about 10 years, before I learned that the most dangerous places in a national park are not always the cliffs, the rivers, or deep country trails that people like to warn visitors about. Sometimes, the worst places are quiet, ordinary looking sections of forest that nobody has a good reason to visit, places without signs, places without overlooks, places that do not appear in brochures because there's nothing beautiful there, nothing dramatic, nothing anybody would think to photograph. They are just blank patches of space between named trails, and because they are blank, people assume that they're empty. The place I'm talking about was called Tallow Basin, though you're not actually going to hear this from a visitor. It was an internal name, the kind that you only saw on old maintenance maps or handwritten notes from staff who had been working the park longer than most of us had been alive. The basin sat in a low stretch of forest east of the main ridge, surrounded by thick pine, deadfall, and a series of shallow gullies that filled with fog after the heavy rain. There was no public trail through it, there was no scenic view, there was no reason for hikers to cut that way unless they were lost or doing something that they shouldn't have been doing. For years, the basin was just one of those areas that we avoided because it's inconvenient. The ground stayed soft most of the year, radios are unreliable there. The trees were growing too close together for easy navigation, and every storm dropped more branches across the old animal paths. It wasn't forbidden exactly, but it was understood that if you didn't need to go into the tallow, you didn't. That's how a lot of the rules in the park actually function. Nobody writes them down, nobody gives a speech. You would in essence notice how that the older rangers would take the long way around, and after a while you start to do the same. The first I heard about it is from Pierce. That's one of our night maintenance guys. The kind who had worked in the park so long that newish staff had assumed that he exaggerated half the things that he said, right up until they realised that he's almost always right. Pierce had been through floods, fires, missing children, illegal hunting cases, drunken campers, storm evacuations, and one lightning strike that split a visitor centre sign clean in half. He didn't scare easily. He did not embellish. If Pierce told you that a bridge was weak, you didn't cross it. If he told you not to park under a certain tree during wind, you move your truck. And if he looked at a place on a map and said, "I'd rather not be there after dark," you would find a different route. The first time he mentioned Tallow Basin to me, we're in the equipment bay during a rainstorm, checking storm lamps and clearing mud off the tyres of one of the utility vehicles. I've only been in that district for a few months, and I was trying to learn from the old staff shortcuts. I asked him twice why the road curved so far around the eastern landfall instead of cutting straight through it, because on the map it looks like a waste of time. He stopped wiping down a shovel and looked at me for a second and said, "Because straight means tallow." Now, then he went back to the clearing and doing what he was doing like nothing ever happened. I asked what's wrong with the tallow and he shrugged, not in a dismissive way, more like somebody deciding how much of the truth was useful. He told me it was wet ground, bad signal, too easy to get turned around. All of these are practical reasons, and then, after a pause, he added that things in tallow had a habit of being found where nobody left them. I asked what do you mean by that, and he then tells me that old tools have a habit of showing up where nobody left them. I say what do you mean by that, and he said, well, gear would just randomly go missing and then show up in another place. Sometimes it could literally be years later. He said it just didn't make sense. Sometimes with mud on them from ground that had been dry all year round. When I laughed, he didn't and said, "You'd understand if you worked here long enough." I didn't understand. Not really at the time. I thought it was just an old ranger superstition. Every district had something like that. A place wrapped in enough half stories that people were treating it as worse than it actually is. Sometimes the stories begin with real incidents. Sometimes they begin with boredom. Sometimes older staff use them to keep the younger staff from wandering into deeper dangerous terrain alone. I assumed Tallow was one of those. Bad ground, bad radio, a few creepy coincidences, but nothing more. The first real trouble began after a dry summer. It turns out that we actually had about 7 weeks of a dry spell. This was quite a lot for us. Now, the smaller creek had dropped into thin muddy channels, and that had cracked some banks. The lake at the edge of the eastern district pulled far enough back to reveal old stumps, rusted cans, and sections of ground that had not been exposed in decades. Visitors loved this at first because it made the shoreline look strange and dramatic, but for us it meant trouble. People started walking where that they shouldn't have been. Kids wandered into mudflats. Anglers found old debris and decided every piece of junk had to be an artifact. We ended up spending more time keeping people away from the unstable ground than anything else. Now that's when somebody reported seeing lights in Tallow Basin. The report came from Pierce himself, who had been driving the Eastern Service Road after checking a locked gate near the lake. He said that he saw several lights low in the tree, moving in a line through the basin. Not flashlights exactly, too dim, too steady. At first he thought that it might be a group of people using cover lamps or phones, maybe trying to avoid being seen. He stopped the truck, killed the headlights, and watches for almost 2 minutes. According to him, the lights did not bob the way that the hand-carried lights should. They moved smoothly, all at the same height, waving through the trees without changing speed. Then they suddenly stop at the same time, all of them. Now, it actually looks like they've reached a marked point. Pierce said that the lights actually went in dark at first, and then comes out brighter. It's almost like they go in a line though, and one forms after the other. The last one stayed on for a few seconds, and then the next one disappeared. He didn't go in after them. Now, people gave him a little grief for it in the next morning, but not too much. Piers worked there 26 years and wasn't the type to invent things for attention. He also wasn't scared easily. If he said something was wrong enough that people shouldn't follow, they listened, even if they pretended not to. The official assumption was trespassers, maybe illegal camping, maybe somebody sneaking into the closed shoreline after dark. My supervisor asked me and another ranger, Denver's, to sweep the basin the next morning and look for signs of unauthorized activity. It was not a search and rescue yet. No one was missing. No one had called for help. It was just a check. The kind of thing that should have taken a couple of hours. We started from the service road just after sunrise. The first thing I noticed is the smell. Tallow Basin always had a damp, earthy smell, but that morning it was stronger, almost sweet underneath, like wet leaves had been in a sealed container for too long. The air was cool despite the dry weather, and a low fog still clung between the trees and even through the rest of the park. Now, Danvers notices it too. He stood at the edge of the road with one hand on his pack strap, looking into the basin, and he said that it felt like we're about to walk into the basement of somewhere. I laughed because I thought he was joking, but he wasn't. He had been at the park for only 3 years, which was long enough to know the terrain, but not long enough for him to thumb it. He still said things out loud that the old staff kept to themselves. He said that the basin looked wrong in the daylight, and I knew exactly what he meant. The fog didn't drift like fog should. It sat low in between the trees, hanging there in uneven strips, thicker in some places than others, like it gathered around things we couldn't see. We found the first sign of people about 15 minutes in. A length of yellow cord tied around sapling at waist height, not our cord. We used orange or pink flagging tape for our surveys and closures. This was old nylon, faded and dirty, tied in a tight knot that looks like it was deliberate. 20 yards beyond it, we found another, then another. They formed a line deeper into the basin, not following any path that I knew. That changed the tone immediately. Random trespassers do not usually mark a route with old cord unless they plan to come back. Poachers sometimes do. People scouting illegal campers do. Now, on the odd occasion, amateur treasure hunters or metal detector types mark spots where they think they found something. Though they usually choose places with known history, Tallow had no history that anybody cared about. At least none that I knew of then. So we followed the chord markers slowly, photographing each one and calling them in the radio. Now, the signal was spotty but not dead. Every few minutes dispatch would come through as a burst of static and half a sentence. Danvers kept checking his compass, more out of habit than need. The route was straight enough that it should have been easy for us to retrace, but something about the basin made you want to confirm everything again and again. After the 6th marker, the tree changed. Not species, just shape. The trunks in that section were bent slightly inwards, all in the same direction, as if years of wind had pushed them together in one invisible centre, but there was no prevailing wind pattern that would do that in a basin. It gave the forest an unpleasant symmetry. The more we walked, the more it looked like the trees were leaning over the route to watch us pass. The ground also changes. The dry upper layer gave to soft black soil that held impression strangely well. We found boot prints there, and at least 3 people from the look of it had been there, all moving in the same direction we are. But mixed with them are other markers, small circular depressions perfectly round about the size of a coin, placed in pairs on either side of the human tracks. At first I thought that they were trekking poles, but the spacing was wrong, too close and consistent. And there was no pole drag marks, no angled punches, nothing to show a person using them for balance, no weight shift. Danvers crouched beside them and said it's weird. That was all, just weird. Rangers say that a lot when they don't want to say worse. I crouched beside him and studied the marks with my flashlight, even though the sun was up. They were clean-edged and deep enough to suggest weight, but the surface around them wasn't disturbed. It looked as if something had pressed down carefully on them, lifted cleanly and then pressed again. Not slide and drag. No natural shift. We actually keep on going though, because we still had boot prints. These people had been there, whoever they were, and they had followed the same line we were following. That was enough to keep the job grounded. I kept remembering telling myself that people had made these prints, real people with real boots and real reasons. The ground round marks were strange, but they could wait. You focus on the human evidence first. The yellow chord markers continue until we reach a clearing that I've never seen before. It sounds impossible because I'd worked that district for years, but Tallow Basin was full of tight growth and hidden pockets of nothing. Still, this clearing felt too large to have been missed. It was almost perfectly circular, rare in nature, maybe 30 feet across, with a dead tree at the centre. The tree had no bark left. The trunk was pale grey, smooth in places, but covered in hundreds of holes. No insect holes, too even. It was too deliberate. They had been drilled. Danvers walked around the tree slowly, shining his light over it, and even though the sun was up. Now, I moved to the edge of the clearing and found the boot prints again. They circled the tree once and then continued on the far right side. The round-paired marks did not circle. They instead stopped at the edge of the clearing and began again, as if whoever made it wanted to avoid the centre entirely. There were objects tied to the dead tree. At first it looked like strips of cloth, but as I got closer, I saw they were tags, old metal ones, the kind used decades ago for equipment inventory or trowel surveys. Some were rusted nearly blank, others still had faint numbers stamped into them. They hung from nails driven into trunk, each one suspended by wire. When the wind moved through the clearing, they touched it lightly, making a dry clicking sound. I took some photos, and Danvers said that we needed to leave it alone until we knew what it was. He's correct. We should have turned around. We should have marked the coordinates and returned with a larger team, but then we found the camera. It was wedged in a hollow at the base of the dead tree, wrapped in a plastic bag and half covered with leaves. It's a modern trail cam, small, black, motion activated. Not park property. The strap there had actually been cut, and the casing was scratched badly around the lens. like something scraped at it with a narrow tool. Now, that gave us a practical reason to stay. Unauthorized camera, possible poaching, possible trespass, evidence. Danvers bagged it, and we followed the tracks a little further. I remembered looking back at the trees before we left the clearing. The tags were still touching each other, clicking lightly, but the breeze had died. The sound continued for 2 or 3 seconds after everything else stopped moving. The route beyond the clearing dipped into a shallow gully. The fog was thicker there, pulled closer to the ground. We could see through though. The air felt colder and the sound changed. Birds had been calling faintly behind us in the gully, but they stopped. Our boots made soft sucking sounds in the damp soil somewhere ahead. Water was slowly dripping, even though there had been no rain. Then the boots ended. All 3 sets stopped in a line at the bottom of the gully, not scattered, not confused turning back. They stopped side by side, facing the same direction beyond them. The ground was smooth, paired with the marks which continue. I remembered looking at that for a long time, waiting for my brain to arrange it into something normal. Maybe the people stepped onto rocks. Maybe the soil changed. Maybe they doubled back and their return tracks were hidden in the same impressions. But there's no rocks. The soil stays soft. There were no return tracks. 3 people had walked to the bottom of the gully and then left with no sign of continuing. But the round marks did. They moved towards the fog. Now Denver stood beside me, silent. After a while he said they were done, and I didn't argue. We backed out the way that we came, marking our route carefully and avoiding the dead tree clearing as much as possible. Nothing followed us. Nothing moved in the trees. But the whole way back, I felt being watched from behind. Not by something close, but by something patient enough to not need distance. We reached the service road and the sunlight felt too bright, almost artificial, and I remembered being embarrassed by how relieved we felt to see the truck. Back at the station, we reviewed the trail camera. That was where the situation changes from strange to something nobody wants to talk about directly. The camera had recorded for 8 nights. Most of the footage is normal. Raccoons, deers, a fox, blowing brush. Then, on night 15, the lights appeared, the same kind of which Piers had described. Small dim points moving through the trees in line. On camera, they looked less like flashlights. They had no beams. They did not illuminate the ground. They were just glowing points, each one steady, moving smoothly from left and then to the right across the frame. After the light came, the people, 3 of them, 2 men and 1 woman, probably in their 20s or 30s, dressed in outdoor gear and carrying packs. They entered the frame from the left, following the line of lights. They don't appear frightened. That was the first thing I noticed. They look focused and calm, almost sleepy. The woman had one hand lifted slightly in front of her, like she was feeling her way through the darkness, but her headlamp was off. They stopped in front of the dead tree, all 3 of them looking up at the same time. The camera doesn't spot what they're looking at. For nearly a minute, none of them moved. Then something passed between them and at the camera. Not a full body, not fully, like a vertical distortion. Like a strip of image that had been pulled downwards. The tree behind it wrapped slightly as it crossed the frame. The people did not react. The distortion moved around them once, and when it passed the camera again, the footage glitches badly. When the image returned, the people were gone. The tags on the tree were moving. The camera recorded for 3 more nights after that. On the final night, something approaches the lens. We never saw a face or body. The frame simply darkened, and this is from the edges inwards, as though something larger than the camera's field of view had leaned over it. Then the scratching began. The sound was low and close, plastic snapping, case creaking. The image shook from 1 frame, maybe less. 2 pale shapes appeared near the bottom of the video. Hands I thought at first, but they were too narrow, too many joints. Then the recording stopped. No one said anything for a while after we watched it. My supervisor, a practical woman named Harris, says if anybody had reported missing persons matching the 3 people on the footage. Now, dispatch checked the local reports, then county, then state, but find nothing. No overdue hikers, no abandoned cars near the trailhead, no campsite reservations, no calls from the family. As far as the outside world's concerned, these people were not missing because nobody said that they were gone, or noticed it. That made things worse. Now, a missing person with a family calling every hour becomes a case with urgency and form. You know what you're looking for. You know where they started. You know who cares. But people who appear on camera and vanish in a closed basin without anybody asking for them become something different. They become proof that the world is bigger and looser than your systems. Somebody can disappear before anybody knows that they need finding. The basin was temporarily closed under the explanation of unauthorized activity and environmental hazard. Harris told us not to spread details until we had clearer information. That was the official line. Unfortunately, everybody knew something was wrong in Tallow. The problem was that wrong does not always give you enough to act on. We had strange footage, unknown people, and tracks that made no sense. We did not have names, bodies, vehicles, or a clear crime scene. 2 days later, the first backpack was found. A volunteer trail worker found it near the lake, half buried in mud, while the receding water exposed the shoreline. It was a grey day pack, modern, dirty but intact. Inside were energy bars, a rain shell, a phone battery pack, and a wallet belonging to a man named Ezra Voss. Ezra Voss was not listed as missing. His address was 3 states away. When authorities contacted the number associated with him, his sister said that she had not heard it from him in 9 months. Now, she thought he was travelling. She sent a photo. He was one of the 2 men from the trail cam. That changes everything. A proper search was organised after, and law enforcement came. The base enclosure expanded. Dogs were brought out. We searched the old shoreline, the service road, the basin, and the surrounding gullies. The search was careful, grid-based, and professional, and deeply uncomfortable from the start. The dogs were behaving strangely near the dead trees clearing. They did not refuse to enter, but they moved low and slow, tails down, noses lifting from the ground as if the scent from above wasn't where it should have been. We found more tags on the tree than before. I am certain of that. I had photographed it in the first day. Now I'd compared the images later. There were at least 7 new tags hanging from trunks. Now same old metal, same wire, same stamped numbers. No one on the search team admitted to touching the tree, and no one had been alone in the clearing. The dogs led us past the gully where the boot prints ended. This time, there were no human tracks, only the paired round marks, faint but visible just, continuing deeper to the basin. We followed them in a line, all 6 of us. We found Harris in front and the law enforcement behind. Nobody spoke much. Radios clicked occasionally. The dogs whined under their breath. The basin smelled sweeter the deeper we went. The kind of sweetness that makes your stomach tighten because it reminds you of decay before you admit it. The markers led to a sinkhole. It is not large at the surface, but maybe 6 feet across. Hidden beneath ferns and almost a collapsed mat of roots, the opening dropped into darkness. The cold air moved out of it slow. Now around the rim were more of the round marks, hundreds of them, overlapping, circling, coming and going in every direction. It looked like something had spent a great deal of time moving around the opening. The camera probe was bent down first. The hole widened beneath the surface into a sloping cavity. Not a cave exactly. More like old washout chamber where the ground had collapsed in on itself over the years. The camera showed roots, wet clay, stones, and pieces of wood embedded into the walls. About 12 feet down, something metallic, a tag, and then another. They were nailed to the roots of the old timber, along the cavity hanging on wire, clicking faintly when the camera brushes past them. Some were corroded like scowls, others were newer. One had numbers from park equipment from the 60s, another like a dog tag, though nobody could read it clearly through the mud. The camera light looks as though it catches fabric, a sleeve. Search stops immediately and the recovery team arrived. They found Ezra Voss first, then the woman, then the second man. All three were in a lower chamber, arranged against a wall, shoulder to shoulder, no obvious trauma, no signs of an animal attack, no broken bones visible. They were muddy and pale, badly decomposing, but not in a way consistent with being there for 9 months. That was one of the first details that the medical examiner quietly struggled with. Exposure in a wet cavity should have been certain. It had not. They looked both too preserved and too ruined, as if the ground had not known what to do with them. The official cause of death was eventually listed as undetermined. That was not the worst thing they found. Behind the bodies further down where the cavity narrowed, the team found more packs, older ones, torn canvas, rotten leather, rusted canteens, a child's shoe, a cracked camera from the 70s, a park radio model that had not been issued in decades. Items from different eras all pushed into the same lower chamber like debris collected by water, except there was no water strong enough to explain what we were seeing. It was really odd to us. Now, everywhere there were tags wedged into the mud, buried in the wood. Nobody stayed down there longer than necessary. One of the recovery workers vomited as he come up, not because of the smell, he said because of the sound. The tags kept clicking and it made him so uncomfortable. The basin was sealed after recovery, not publicly, not dramatically. The sinkhole was fenced, marked unstable, and covered with a lock until geologists could assess the area. That was the explanation. Unstable ground, hazardous void, no public access. It was true enough, but the lights came back 3 nights later. This time I saw them myself. I was on a patrol road with Pierce when we passed the service road turnaround. He slowed without saying anything. I looked through the windshield and saw 3 of them behind the trees, low and steady, moving in a line through the basin. 5 lights this time, maybe 6. They glided between the trunks in the direction of the dead tree clearing. Pierce did not stop the truck. He just kept driving. I did not tell him to turn around. The next morning, the grate over the sinkhole was still locked. The fence itself was undisturbed, but every metal tag had been removed from the dead tree. All of them. The nails remained, the wires remained, but the tags are gone. In the mud at the base of the tree were paired around with fresh impressions. Fresh. Harris ordered the entire dead tree to be cut down and removed. The crew did it in daylight, with 6 people present and 2 trucks running nearby. The wood was hauled out and burned as contaminated material because nobody wanted it stored anyway. I watched the smoke rise from the maintenance yard burn pit and felt relief, but it quickly vanishes. For a few weeks, nothing happened, and the basin is quiet. There's no lights or anything really. No reports, no tracks. People start talking about it less. The way they do when something becomes too uncomfortable and too unsolved. Officially, the case belongs to law enforcement and environmental assessment. Unofficially, most of us just avoid it after dark. Then Danvers found the first tag. It was hanging from the rear view mirror to his personal truck. He found it at home, parked in the driveway outside of the park. An old metal inventory tag on a piece of wire rusted at the edges, being stamped with 4 numbers. He called me before he called anybody else. His voice sounds flat, like he had already decided that there was no version of this conversation that would make him feel better. He said every door on the truck had been locked, no window broken, no camera at his house showed anybody entering the driveway. He brought the tag in. Harris took it, bagged it, and told him to file a report. 2 days later, Pierce found one tied to his porch railing. Then I found mine. It was in my boot, not besides it, not near it, inside. I found it at 5 in the morning before a shift, where my foot hit something cold and sharp in the toe. I pulled off the boot and shook it. and the tag fell to the ground with a small metallic clink that sounded far louder than it should have. It was wet with black mud. I know I'd locked my door that night, and I have no pets. Nobody should have been inside. The tag was stamped with the number 14. That number meant nothing to me. Then I remembered from the photos of the dead tree, one of the tags in my original images had been stamped 14. Same dented corner, same rusted pattern. It had been on the tree. Then it had been gone, but now it was with me, in my boot. This was the only time I considered quitting, not simply transferring, but quitting. Walking away from the park entirely and finding something where there's walls, fluorescent lights, and no tree line visible from the parking lot. But fear gets complicated when it attaches itself to responsibility. Harris had called a morning meeting with the small group who knew the most. She did not use dramatic language. She didn't say anything haunting or eerie like that. She simply says that she had a contamination of evidence, possibly targeted harassment by unknown individuals or groups connected to the incident. That was a sentence she used, target harassment specifically, unknown individual or group. It was a kind of language that people use when the truth is standing too close by and they need a desk between themselves and it. The park brought in additional law enforcement and cameras were installed all around the service road, the basin entrance, the sinkhole fence and the maintenance yard. No staff parking for a while. That made everybody feel better. Then the cameras start failing, not all at once but one at a time, always between 2 and 3 in the morning. Now the footage would glitch, darken at the edges and return again. In the missing seconds, nothing obvious happened, no figure walking by, no hand reaching in, but objects changed position, a gate found open, a cone moved, a coil of rope straightened into a line. Once a camera in the maintenance yard came back to show 6 metal tags, all of which are hanging from the fence directly in front of it. Now there was no wind though. The tags were removed with gloves and bagged. By the morning, the evidence bags were empty, no cuts, no tears, no broken seals, just empty. After that, Harris stopped pretending it was only harassment. She had to write the official report but she changed as a person. She becomes quieter, more direct. She told us that nobody was to enter the basin alone. No one could touch any tag or cord or unmarked object without witnesses. No one was to follow the lights under any circumstances. If the lights are observed, then they should be so from a distance and recorded. The last instruction should have been enough, but it wasn't. The final incident occurred in October. After the first real rain in months, rain had returned, turning the dry creek beds into brown channels and filling the lake enough to cover the exposed shoreline again. Everyone hoped that things would settle. If it didn't, if anything, the basin almost come back stronger. The basin seemed to wake up from the water. Fog came back thicker than before. The service road stayed damp after the sun. The air nearest turns rotten and sour again. A call came from a pair of photographers who had entered the park before dawn to shoot fog near the lake. They reported seeing a man walking along the closed service road carrying a lantern. Not a flashlight, a lantern. They had crossed the road ahead of the car and entered near the trees. When they slowed, he turned around and looked directly at them. They thought that he might be staff until they noticed his bare foot. That was enough to trigger a response. Harris told law enforcement to hold at the road. She and I went in only to the closure fence to check for break-ins. We did not plan to enter Basin. We did not follow anything. We're not brave enough. But we're being careful. The fence is intact. The lock was intact. The warning signs are untouched, but beyond the fence, about 30 yards in the trees, a lantern burned on the ground. It was old metal, with dirty glass and a smell of a steady flame inside. Besides it, we can see a park radio. Harris and I both recognized the model. It was the old type recovered from the sinkhole chamber. The radio should have been in evidence. Harris swore under her breath and I called it in. The signal worked at first and then broke to static. The fog moved between the trees, thickening around the lantern until it became a blurred yellow smear. I remember telling myself not to look away from it, because I had the sudden certainty that if I did, it would be closer when I looked back. Harris ordered me to stay at the fence while she unlocks the gate. I told her that's a bad idea. She knew it, but evidence is evidence. A recovered radio from a sealed case had somehow appeared in an unrestricted area that has to be documented. She opens the gate, stepped through, and stopped immediately. The lantern went out, not dimmed, it went out. Fog swallowed the space where it had been. Then the tags start clicking. At first, I thought the sound was rain dripping from the leaves, but it was too dry and metallic. It was from deeper in the basin, from the left and then to the right. Now it is behind a fence, dozens of metal pieces touching each other in the fog. Harris backed up slowly. I reached for the gate. Something moves behind her. Not a person, but something tall. And it was a distortion in the fog, like the shape from the camera, a vertical strip where trees bent inward and light failed to pass through correctly. It crosses behind Harris without making a sound. I shout her name. She turns towards me, and for a second I saw her face change. Not fear exactly, but recognition. Like she had just seen something in the fog that made sense to her in a way that it hadn't to me. Then the ground opened up under her. It was not dramatic like a movie. No massive collapse, no explosion of dirt. One moment she was stepping backwards, and next, her right leg dropped through the forest floor until the hip. She grabbed a root, and I lunged through the gate after her. The soil around her was soft and black, almost like wet ash. I caught her wrist and pulled. Something below pulled. I felt it. There was a mud suction, not gravity, a tug, hard and deliberate. Harris screamed once, not words, just pain and terror. I dropped to my knees, braced both boots against a root and pulled with everything I had. The clicks, tags are louder around us now, thousands of tiny metallic sounds in the fog. My hand slipped on her sleeve and she grabbed my forearm with both hands. Her eyes had fixated on something over me and she said, "Don't let it count you." That was the last thing that she said before the pressure released. I fell backwards with her half on top of me. Her leg came free, covered in mud up to the fire. The boot gone, pant leg torn, skin ripped raw. We scrambled out through the gate, slammed it shut, and locked it with both hands at barely work. Now the clicking stopped, the fog thinned, and the lantern was gone. The old radio was gone. Harris survived, but she never returned to work. The doctor said her injuries were consistent with a fall through unstable ground. That was true in the same way everything official about there was. The basin was then sealed permanently after that, not just fenced but filled. The sinkhole was pumped with concrete, the lower chamber is sealed, the old service road was blocked with boulders. The park map was actually updated now, and the entire eastern lowland was classified as an ecological restriction zone, closed for all access. The public accepted it, because the public maps had been updated to show it wasn't really there. For a while we thought that was the end of it. No lights were reported for nearly a year, no tags appeared, no cameras fouled. Tallow Basin became a place people mentioned less and less, until newer staff only knew of it through rumours. But then Pierce retired. At his farewell gathering, he gave a short speech and thanked everybody, made a joke about finally sleeping past sunrise and left before dark. 2 weeks later, he mailed me an envelope with no return address. Inside a photograph, not a recent one, old and faded. It showed a group of rangers standing near the Eastern Service Road, maybe in the 1970s, all smiling except for one man at the edge of the frame. Behind them, partly visible between the trees, was a dead pal trunk covered in metal tags. Now, on the back, Pierce had written one sentence. They were counting before we got there. I still have that photograph. I kept it sealed in a folder in my drawer I rarely open. Sometimes I think about destroying it, but I never do, because part of me believes that only things worsen when you try and destroy them. Blank places are dangerous, is what he wrote on it. Now, I no longer work in that district. I transferred west 2 years after Harris left, and I've not gone back to the Eastern Road since, and I've not seen the lights again. I've not found another tag, nothing's followed me, not in any way that I can prove, but every so often, usually in damp weather, I swear that I hear metallic clicks again where they shouldn't be. And every so often, I'm convinced I can see the half glow of a lantern, and then it just suddenly disappears again. So I've been working the west side of the park for about 8 years, before anybody ever told me about the survey stakes. Even then, it was not presented like a warning. It came up during a routine map correction meeting, the kind of meeting where everybody's tired before it starts because the agenda is usually just trails, erosion and closures. There's slow arguments about the map to say what's actually happening with it. One of the older rangers, a woman named Keane, pointed to a blank section of North Elk Run and said, "There's old wooden stakes there, which should be removed if anybody ever found them." She said it plainly, like she was reminding us not to park in front of the equipment bay. Nobody asked why. That was a part I noticed later. Nobody asked why. The area was called Northcut, at least that's what we called it, though there was no official trail name. Decades back, before the park expanded, there had been a logging road running through that section, but the forest swallows most of it. What remained was a long strip of uneven ground, a few rotting culverts, and the occasional straight lines of old trees that showed where the roadbed once had been. It was not really scenic. It was not dangerous in the obvious way. It was just inconvenient, damp, easy to overlook, the kind of place that you only entered because something forces you to. For the most of that summer, nothing forces us to. The public trails stay busy. The lake campgrounds kept us occupied. The Northcut remained exactly how it had been for years, a forgotten piece of forest between places which mattered. And then, we had a storm coming through in late August, hard enough for trees to drop across 3 trails and wash mud over the lower section of Service Road. Now we spent 2 days clearing the main routes, then another half day checking the older drainage lines that fed towards Elk Run. That's how I ended up in the Northcut with a seasonal ranger named Mattis and a chainsaw strapped into the back of the utility vehicle. Mattis was new, but not useless. Now, there is a difference. The seasonal hires arrive thinking that the park is a summer adventure with a uniform attached. Mattis was not like that. He listened, worked hard, and had good instinct to slow down when something felt off, instead of pretending like he knew anything. Now, that morning, he was the one who notices the first stake. We had parked beside an old culvert and were checking a washout when he calls me over. The stake stood about 20 feet into the trees, half hidden by fern, weathered and grey and leaning slightly but still driven deep into the ground. There's a strip of red cloth which has been tied around the top, so faded it almost looked brown. I knew immediately it was one of the stakes that Keane had mentioned. It was not modern survey equipment, no plastic cap, no bright paint, no stamp marker, just a wooden post, squared by hand with a notch cut into one side. I took a photo and told Mattis to leave it alone. He asked what it marked. I said that I didn't know, which is actually true. He asked if we should record the coordinates, and I said yes, because that sounded professional. But there's something about entering and pointing to a GPS which made me feel like I was acknowledging something that I don't want to get myself involved with. We then found the second stake about 10 minutes later, then a third. They were not in a straight line, at least not one that we could see from ground level. They formed a broad curve through the trees, each one almost exactly the same height, each one marked with a faded strip of cloth, each one notched on the same side. Some were old enough that moss had grown up their bases, others looked newer. Those still weathered, that bothered me. If these were left from some survey, forgotten about decades ago, They should have all aged the same way, and they had not. Mattis wanted to follow them. I told him that we had work to finish, that was true, but it was not the real reason. The real reason was that I remembered Keen's voice in the meeting, the flatness of it when she said not to remove them, and I'd become suddenly aware that nobody had explained why those stakes were there. In park work, unexplained things are usually not always mysterious, but they're always going to be someone's problem. I did not want them to become mine. We cleared the culvert, marked the washout, and headed back before the afternoon rain started. I wrote the stakes into the maintenance notes as unverified historic markers and flagged them for review. That should have been the end of my involvement, but it's not. 3 days later, a volunteer trail crew reported finding a tent in the Northcut, not on a trail, not near a designated site. It's actually deep enough in the trees that whoever placed them there had probably done so illegally and shouldn't have been there. Now, we had illegal camping, it's not unusual, but this tent was strange from the beginning. It was clean, modern, and fully pitched, with the rainfly tights and the guidelines set properly. There was no fire ring nearby, no food hung from the branch, no trash, no boot prints around it that the crew could identify. The entrance was zipped closed, and inside there's a sleeping bag. There's also a backpack, a pair of boots, and a notebook, but no person. The boots were the detail that got everyone's attention. People leave tents, abandon gear, people panic and run, but they do not usually walk away barefoot into rough forest, especially not through deadfall and thorny ground. The crew backed out and called it in. I was sent with Keen to check the site because she also knew the Northcut better than anybody else, and because I'd already logged the stakes with that area. Keen was quiet in driving out. She was usually direct, sometimes funny, but that morning she barely spoke. When she entered the park near the old culvert, she sat there for a moment with both hands on the wheel, even though the engine was off. She then turns and says that if we find more stakes, do not step inside the line. I asked her what line. She looked at me then, and I realised that she had assumed that I knew more than I did. Her face changes, not dramatically, but enough. She said, "The stakes aren't markers, they're boundary pieces." That's all that she said before getting out. We hiked in from culvert, following the volunteer crew's GPS point. The forest was wet from overnight rain and the air heavy and close. Every branch of which we brush releases water onto our sleeves. The ground smelled dark and churned. And the further we moved into the Northcut, the more I noticed the old stakes appearing between the trees. Not many at first. One here, another 50 yards beyond, another almost hidden behind a stump. Then more, always with the north facing inwards. Keen watches them constantly. She didn't say anything. She adjusted our route more than once to stay outside the curve they made. After a while, I start seeing it too. The stakes did not form a line. Well, not a straight one. They tranced in a large uneven oval around a section of forest that looked no different from the rest. Maybe 5 acres, maybe more. It was hard to judge. The tent's inside. We stopped at the edge. The tent sat in between 2 hemlocks which are green and grey, nearly invisible until the headlamp beam caught the tensioned fabric. Around it, the ground was strangely clean. No leaves piled against the sides, no broken twigs, no mud splashed on the rainfly despite the storm. It looked like somebody had placed it there after rain, except the volunteer crew had found it there before the rain started. Keen called out before we approached. No answer. She called again, and nothing. We moved slowly towards it, stepping carefully, and I noticed the silence then. Not total silence. There was wind in the canopy and water dripping from the leaves, but the small background sounds are missing. No insects, no birds, no squirrel chatter. The forest had gone observational. The tent zipper was closed but not locked. Keen opened it with gloved hands. The inside was dry, neat, and deeply wrong in a way that I didn't understand at first. Sleeping bag rolled open, pack upright, boots placed together by the entrance, notebook on top of the sleeping bag. No wallet, no phone, no identification, no blood or signs of struggle. It looked like somebody had undressed for sleep, placed everything in order, and then ceased to be there. Keen did not enter. She crouched outside and photographed everything. Then she leaned in and picked up the notebook. The first few pages are normal enough. Mileage notes, plant sketches, and weather observations. The owner was likely an amateur naturalist, or somebody doing personal field journaling. Then the entries were changed. The handwriting became tighter, shorter, and less descriptive. Only one page had a date and the sentence. They were standing at the edge when I wake up. Another read, I moved the tent this morning, but it was back inside. The actual final written page said, I counted the stakes yesterday and got 47, today 48. Kane closes a notebook. I asked her what it meant. She didn't answer directly. She looked around the depression, then towards the nearest stake, and she said, we need more people. We need daylight the whole time. It was only mid-morning, but I understood what she meant. This was not a quick search. This was a simple abandoned campsite, but not what it appeared to be. We backed out the same way that we come in, carefully not disturbing anything. As we crossed the boundary line again, I looked back to the tent. For a second, and only a second, I thought I saw somebody standing behind the trees. Not a clear figure, just the impression of a person facing us from behind the depression. I stopped walking. Kane stopped because I did. When I blinked, there was nothing there. And we organised a proper search that afternoon. The law enforcement came in, 2 dog teams, 4 rangers, a county search coordinator. The working assumption was a missing camper, possibly injured, possibly disorientated, last known at the tent site. Now we still didn't know who the person was. The notebook had no name, no gears or no tags. The pack contained food, spare clothes, a water filter, and a small camera with a dead battery, but no phone, no wallet or keys. The dogs had trouble from the start. They picked up at the tent and circled the depression, then pulled towards the boundary stakes. Both dogs stopped at the line and refused to cross outwards. This is the exact opposite of what we had expected. If somebody had left the tent and walked away, scent should have let out. Instead, the dogs behaved as if the person's scent ended at the boundary and turned back inside. One handler tried to encourage his dog forward, but the dog sat down, ears flat, staring into the staked area. The search grid expanded inwards. Then it's discovered that the stakes were not just around the outside. There's more in the inside. The smaller ones, shorter, older, half buried in moss. They form smaller curves with the boundary looped in partial circles around the tree, depressions and boulder, and patches of bare soil where nothing grew. Each stake had the same notch cut into it, always facing inwards, always marked with cloth or some thread or some old fragment tied around the top. Some had numbers carved into them, others had names, not full names, single words, maybe surnames, maybe something else. Val, Rusk, Dyer, Callow, Howe, Marrow. The search coordinator thought that these are probably historical markers and even logged the references. Keane said nothing, but I saw her face tighten every time somebody stopped over something. Now by then, there were too many people moving, too much radio traffic, too much procedural momentum. Once a search begins, it's hard to tell everybody to stop because the woods feel wrong, especially when somebody may be alive. Now we searched until dusk and found no one. What we did find were things though. There was a wall sock hanging from a branch about 6 feet off the ground. There's also a cracked compass that's placed perfectly on a stump. A set of blue tent fabric around a root. A single human tooth, clean and white, resting on the top of a flat stove. The last one changed the search again. The mood shifts now, immediately. You could feel it passing through the group, without anybody really saying much. We're no longer looking for a lost camper. The tooth went into evidence, the area around it's photographed, gridded, searched inch by inch. No blood, no bone fragment, no signs of animal scavenging, just a tooth, placed as neatly as a coin. At dusk, Keane insisted we pulled everyone out. The county coordinator wanted to keep going with headlamps, but Keane refused. I've never seen her speak to law enforcement that way before. She said no one was staying inside the stakes after dark. The coordinator asked if that's an official rule. Keane said it is now. There was a tense moment where I thought he might argue harder, but the dog handlers backed away. The dogs had been uneasy all afternoon, and nobody wanted to force a night search in dense terrain without scent direction. We left the tent where it was and taped the perimeter and hike out. On the way back, I count the outer stakes without meaning to. 48. The notebook had been right, and the next morning there were 49. The new stake stood on the south side of the boundary, driven into the soft ground besides a rotten stump. It was lighter than the others and freshly cut. The top was still pale where the wood had been trimmed. A strip of blue tent fabric was tied around it. Nobody admitted placing it. Nobody had been inside the closure overnight, and we had 2 posted officers at the service road, but both swore nobody had been past them. The missing person became more complicated when the camera battery was changed. Most of the photos were ordinary, plants and mushrooms, old covert stones, other really normal things like insects on leaves and the sort of thing that somebody might document if they're interested in ecology. Then there were pictures of stakes, dozens of them, close-up notches, cloth strips, and carved names. The last 30 photos were all taken at night. Now, the first image, actually from the first night, was showing from outside the tent, as if the camera had been set on a stump facing it. The tent glowed faintly from a lantern inside, nothing unusual. Then, in the next image, several dark shapes stood at the edge of the clearing beyond the tent, not close enough to see clearly, which are human-sized but uneven, partly hidden by trees. They stood in a wide arc along the boundary. In the next photo they were closer, and closer still. The tent remains lit. No one appeared to come out. The first image showed the tent from inches away. The green fabric filled most of the frame. Pressed against it from the outside was the shape of a hand, with long fingers, too long. The fabric stretches inwards under from pressure. Behind the hand, through the blurred nylon, there was a faint outline, as if something was leaning in close. The timestamp read 3:17 a.m. Keane looked at the photo for a long time and said, "It wasn't outside. I say, what do you mean?" And she pointed to the way the fabric stretches. The hand was clearly pressing from the inside of the tent. I remembered feeling a cold move through me as the room went quiet. The missing camper had taken night photos on the tent from the outside. Then something had been photographed up close to the tent. Then a hand press from the inside, but the camera had been found in the camper's pack inside the tent with nobody out there. The order of events doesn't make sense. Now, by then, the law enforcement had identified the missing camper through the tooth. Dental records match a person who I'm going to call Adrian Locke, 31 from a few states away. That raises questions more than it answered. His family didn't report him missing because he was on a solo trip, something he had done before. His car was eventually found at a public parking area 12 miles from Northcut. Now, there was no clear route from the lot to the scent site unless he had knowingly crossed the terrain. His family said that he'd become interested in old park boundaries and finding scanned maps online. He had emailed a friend about the stake circles and unlisted plots in the park, but the friend thought it was just search for a photographic project. In one message, Adrian wrote that he believes the stakes are not survey markers but warnings. In another he wrote, "They don't mark what belongs to people, they mark what people belong to." That sentence got copied into the case file, and nobody likes it. They continue the search for 4 days. We found the small items then, each placed carefully, like a shoelace, camera lens cap, a folded map page, a torn piece of notebook paper with no writing on it, another tooth. The dogs never found a trail leading out though. The scent stays inside the boundary, moving in loops that made no sense. Sometimes it crossed itself, sometimes it ended at one of the smaller stakes and began again on the far side without any scent between them. On the 4th day, one of the dog handlers found a shallow pit covered with branches. It was inside of one of the smaller circles, near the north edge of the boundary. The pit was not deep, maybe 3 feet deep, lined with flat stones. At the bottom are dozens of cloth strips tied into knots. It was red cloth, blue cloth, old white and brown coloured with age, modern synthetic ribbon, pieces of shoelace, backpack strap, and what looks like part of a child's jacket. Each strip had been tied around a small wooden peg and pushed into the soil. No body, no bones except for one tooth already found, and then another. No explanation, but the pit smelled awful. Not rotten, but like wet fabric which has been sealed there under something metallic. Keane ordered it photographed and covered again until a forensic team could handle it. The county coordinator objected, saying that we need to process it fully. Keane said that he could not do it in daylight without proper equipment, but nobody was staying late. Now, again, she won. Again, the dogs were part of why. One of them refuses to face the pit when it's opened. It kept turning its head away and pressing against the handler's leg. That evening, as we're hiking out, Mattis suddenly stopped ahead of me. I asked what's wrong, and he pointed. There was a stake pointing in the middle of the old logging road. It had been there that morning. We should have seen it. Everybody would have. It was driven directly into the roadbed, straight and fresh, with a strip of yellow cord tied around the top, the notch facing towards us. Nobody touched it. We walk around in a wider arc. We reach the vehicles. Mattis was pale and quiet. I asked if he's okay, and he said that he had counted the outer stakes in the morning, just out of curiosity, and he said there was 50. I told him there'd been 49 the day before, and he nodded. There was one in the main road. That night, Kim came to the station hours after and pulled out one of the oldest drawer maps that I've ever seen from the archives. I found her there near midnight, sitting under the weak fluorescent lights, surrounded by rolled survey sheets and brittle paper. She did not seem surprised to me. Now, she looked exhausted, older than she had that morning. She told me that the stakes had been there before the park. Not all of them, but the first ones. The earliest land records showed irregular boundary claims in the Northcut from the 1800s, back when logging companies and private landholders argued over timber rights. One surveyor recorded unreliable markers in that area and refused to clarify a parcel because the markers moved between visits. Another one had wrote about locally placed claim stakes of unknown origin and recommended avoiding the lower ground until proper lines are established. A third map had a section labelled simply Disputed Enclosure. Disputed by who? Keane shook her head. Then she showed me a photocopy of a handwritten note from 1911. It was from a timber company foreman complaining that men refused to work the Northcut after finding stakes around their campsite in the morning. They pulled them, burned them, threw them into the creek, and the next day they would appear. The final line read, "The men behave in a weird way, believing the wood is claiming them by counts." Now, I asked Keane why she never said any of this earlier. She said it was because until Adrian Loke, the stakes had mostly stayed where they were. The old rule was simple: don't remove them, don't camp inside them, don't count them, don't follow any new line that appears overnight. She said most incidents over the years involved people finding odd objects, getting turned around, or feeling watched, but nothing like this. No missing teeth or cameras, no new stakes appearing. She said something that made the air feel colder. She said, "I think he studied them too closely." The next morning, the tent was gone. Not taken down, but gone. The depression where it had stood was empty. The ground beneath was dark and flat. The tape around the site was still up. The perimeter had not been disturbed. The officers posted overnight saw no one enter. The camera trap that we set facing the tent recorded static. When the image returns, the tent was gone. In its place was a stake, fresh wood, with blue fabric tied around the top, notch facing inward. Nobody spoke for a while. The forensic team processed the pit, the stake, the depression, everything. They found traces of Adrian's DNA on the cloth, but no blood or saliva, but they do start finding skin cells on several knots. They also found partial fingerprints, but too distorted to match. They found nothing that explained where the tent went, no drag marks or no marks that would make it clear that people had been there, just absence. By then, the search had become a recovery operation in everybody's mind, but nobody said it. Adrian Locke was not expected to be found alive, but the body mattered, the family needed it, the case needed it, the people working on the case needed some closure or sense to make of everything. On the 6th day, we found the first piece of him. I won't describe in detail because some things do not need that. It was close enough to identify as human. It was found inside a hollow log, wrapped in a blue tent fabric so deep in the hollow that somebody would have had to crawl to reach unnaturally far to have actually got it there. And around the log stood 7 small stakes in a tight circle, each one notched inward. After that, the search became grim and mechanical. We found more over the next few days, not scattered like animal predation, not randomly hidden, but placed. Each part inside a circle, each circle marked by stakes, each stake counted, photographed, mapped and removed only after evidence processing. And each time a stake was removed, another appeared somewhere else by morning. Now people started making mistakes, only small ones at first. A deputy forgot where he parked. A volunteer walked some 50-yard grid 3 times instead of finding where the flags should have been. Mattis found a knot shaven in his pocket and doesn't know how it got there. One of the dog handlers quit on the spot after her dog came back from a short sweep with a strip of red cloth tied around its collar. She said nobody had been near the dog and I believed her. Keen held together longer than anybody, but she started to see and showed cracks. She stopped sleeping much and she carried a hatchet in addition to her normal gear. She checked every doorway before stepping through, even inside our station. Once I saw her standing in the parking lot at dusk, staring towards the North Road, silently counting on her fingers. I asked what she's doing and she said nothing. On the 9th day, the outer boundary had 58 stakes. On the 10th, 63. We stopped counting. That was Keen's order. Nobody wanted to count the stakes anymore. Nobody would. No jokes, no guesses. If a stake appeared, it was to be marked by location only, not number. She said this after a junior deputy said that there had to be too many to count. And he also developed a nosebleed so heavy that he had to be taken back to the road. Coincidence? Probably. Dry air, exertion and stress, but didn't seem to be given the circumstances. The final search day came after rain. A heavy storm moved through overnight, flattening ferns, swelling the gullies. It actually turned the old road into mud. We expected the search area to be a mess. Instead, the staked boundary was clearer than ever. Leaves had washed away from the bases, cloth strips everywhere. The smaller inner circles stood out like deliberate designs on the floor. At the centre of the largest inner circle, where no pit had been the day before, the ground had sunk, a narrow opening led downwards between the roots. Cold air was moving out of it, but not a breeze. Keen would not let anybody go down first, cameras first, a light and a pole. The opening widened into a chamber with tangled roots, with wooden stakes driven horizontally into each. There was a lot of them. It was really odd. Then the camera found Adrian. What was left of him had been arranged in the chamber. Not exactly intact, but ordered. That was a word I hate, but it's the only word to fit the description of what I'd seen. It was ordered, like something had taken him apart and placed him where that they thought he belonged. The recovery team at first refused to enter until the openings widened and shortened. It took hours. By late afternoon, the weather shifted, and fog begins forming between the trees. Keen watched it with a keen eye, and I've never seen her look like this before. She had fear, but also anger, like she had warned the world properly, but it hadn't listened. We recovered Adrian after dark, well, most of him. Even though his family got remains to bury, the case got an end in. Cause of death was never made public in any detail. The official phrasing was exposure and animal activity after death, but everybody on the recovery team knows that this doesn't really add up too well. The Northcut was then closed permanently. Now, this is actually with a blockade, so nobody can ever go there again. Now, Kane retired a few months afterward. Before she left, she gave me a small envelope with, inside of it was a photocopy, and that was from the 1911 foreman's note and hand-drawn map of the outer boundary, where she first said that it had all started. And apparently there was 22 stakes in, and then he reported there was more. I asked her how many there are now, and she's forgotten. She looked at me and said enough for us to notice. Now, for a while nothing happened. The Northcut stays closed, and no missing persons reported, no strange gear reports, and no camera static, just nothing too out of the ordinary. No volunteer crews wandering near the boundary. We all began doing what we would have done normally. We rebuilt over it, and we stopped bringing it up. We let the forest become ordinary again because we needed that. Then almost a year later, I was sent to inspect the storm damage near the Elk Run after a wind event. I did not enter the Northcut. I got near to the old boundary. I stayed on the legal trail, checked the fallen trees and photographed erosion. And I turned back before dusk. On the hike out, I found a wooden stake beside the trail, just one, a POW strip with blue fabric at the top, notch facing me. I stood there for a while, not moving, just not really sure what to do, not even breathing properly. Every part of me was suddenly aware of the trees, the wet ground, the fading light. I didn't count anything. I didn't touch it. I didn't photograph it. That was against procedure. The procedure belonged to a world where evidence stays where you left it. I walked back to the truck slowly, forcing myself not to run. When I reached the station, I wrote the storm reports and left the stake out of it. That night, I checked my boots before putting them on by the door. Nothing inside. I checked my pockets, nothing. Then just before bed, I noticed a speck of mud on my kitchen floor, and then another, and a faint line leading from the back door to the table. On the table was a very small strip of blue fabric. I burned it in the sink. I moved out of the house after 2 weeks and transferred to another area for winter. I've not been back to the Northcut since. I don't know what become of the boundary. I don't know if the stake near Elk Run was ever found by anybody else. I don't know if new ones appeared after I left. I've never asked that question. I still work as a ranger, yes. I still walk close trails when the job requires it. But I still believe the most strange things in the woods usually have explanations if you're patient enough to find them. But I also know that there are places old enough to have rules which weren't written by us. Places where the forest doesn't need to chase you, speak to you, or show itself clearly. It only has to mark the ground and wait for you to step inside. And if you ever notice an old row of stakes in the ground in a forgotten part of the woods, especially if they're notched on one side with cloth, just leave it alone and act like you've never seen it before, because some boundaries are there not to keep you out, they are there to make you know where you belong. So I took the assignment because nobody else wanted it, which is usually a sign that you shouldn't take it at all, but I'd been with the service long enough to know that the jobs people avoid are either the ones that turn out to be nothing at all, or something that you remember for the rest of your life. At the time, I still believed that those were two separate outcomes. The area was a narrow valley on the far side of the park, cut off by a collapsed bridge after a long stretch of trail that had officially been closed after repeated washouts, which meant that the only way in was on foot through a maintenance path that hadn't been cleared in years. And the report that sent me out there was simple enough on paper. Just a series of complaints from a group of backcountry hikers who said something had been leaving structures along the trail, small ones at first, like stacks of sticks neatly arranged, which aren't natural, and then larger ones like frames lashed together with strips of bark, and finally something that looks like a shelter but wasn't built in the way that any shelter would be. There was wrong angles, wrong materials, and wrong placement. All of it positioned just off the trail like it was meant to be seen but not approached. The hikers hadn't stayed long enough to get a proper look because one of them said that the structures hadn't been there when they passed through the first time. And when they came back, it was there, as though it had actually been built in the space of a few hours, but without anybody actually being there to build them. So I set out early in the morning with enough gear for a long day, but not enough for an overnight because I expected to walk in, document everything that had been left behind, and walk out again before dark. And the first few miles were exactly what I expected. Overgrown but manageable, the kind of trail where you spend more time watching your footing than your surroundings, stepping over fallen branches, ducking under the lower limbs, and just doing work there generally, but nothing unusual about the forest itself. No silence, no strange smells, no signs of disturbance beyond what you'd expect in a place that hadn't seen regular traffic in a while. But about 3 miles in, I found the first structure. It wasn't much, just a small arrangement of sticks against a tree, but it was too deliberate to be random. Each piece had been put there with care, ends aligned and angles consistent, like somebody had taken time to make it look like something was supposed to be there, even though it didn't have any function. It's weird, and I decided to photograph it, mark the location and move on, expecting to find a few more like it and then nothing. But within another half a mile, I found a second one, larger this time. A rough frame made of thicker branches tied together with strips of bark that looks like it's been peeled there cleanly from nearby trees. That was when I noticed that there were no tool marks anywhere, no knife cuts, no saw lines, nothing that indicated that the bark had been removed or the branches had been shaped, and the ground around it was undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks, no broken undergrowth, just the structure itself sitting there as though it had been assembled without anybody ever building it. So I kept on going now, deeper into the forest. The deeper I went, the more frequent that they become, each one a little more complex than the last. Some of these are forming partial walls, others leaning into shapes that almost resemble doorways or windows, none of them actually enclosed with anything. And they're always positioned just far enough from the trail that you had to step away from your path to see them properly, which I did the first time out of habit, but after a while I started feeling like this was a part of a design, like they were placed to pull you off the trail one step at a time. Not enough to get lost, just enough to shift your attention away from what you're actually doing. By the time I reached the point where the hikers had marked the larger structure, the light had started to change. Not exactly darker, just flatter, like the depth had been pulled out of the forest, and the sounds had thinned out in a way that made everything feel more distant. I remembered thinking that I should turn back because the trail would soon become slower and harder to navigate, but I also remembered telling myself that I was close enough to the main site that it would be a waste of time not to at least see it before heading back, which is the kind of reasoning that gets you in trouble because it sounds sensible in the moment. The main structure wasn't a structure in the way others are. It was something entirely else, a series of frames built into each other, layers of branches woven and bent into shape that suggests a shelter, but it doesn't function like that. It's too open in some places and too dense in others. The angles are all wrong. The proportions are off, like it had been built by something that understood the idea of shelter without understanding how a person would actually use one. And it stood into a small clearing that I had noticed, which isn't on any maps. The grounds there are packed flat and bare of undergrowth, as if it had been cleared repeatedly over time. I circle it slowly, taking photos from every angle, careful not to step too close because something about it felt off in a way of which I cannot explain. Not threatening exactly, but just wrong. Like it didn't belong in the same set of rules of everything else around it. And as I moved around to the far side, I noticed that there were more of the same similar structures beyond the clearing, arranged in a loose pattern that extended into trees. Not a straight line, not a circle, something irregular but still intentional, like a path that had been marked without being meant for walking. That's when I heard something behind me. Not a voice, not an animal, Just the sound of something moving where nothing should have been there. And when I turned around, there was nothing there. Just a trail leading back the way I'd come, and for a moment I considered that I might have misjudged the distance or light or something else entirely. But then I noticed one of the smaller structures near the edge of the clearing positioned differently than where it had been when I first seen it. Not by much, just enough that I couldn't be sure if I was remembering it correctly, that the uncertainty was worse than I could have been if I was certain something had moved it. I decided to leave then, not in a panic, just with a clear sense that I had seen enough for one day, and that whatever this was didn't need me there any longer, and I turned around towards the trail and started walking at a steady pace, not rushing, but not lingering either. And for the first few minutes, everything felt normal again, the forest closing in behind me, the trail narrowing, and the sounds returning in small pieces. But then I noticed the structures again, not just off the trail but closer now, some of them right at the edge of the path, angled towards it in a way that made them feel like they were facing me as I passed. I tell myself it's just perspective, that I didn't pay as much attention on the way in, that I was reading patterns in something that don't have any. But the further I went, the more explanation felt thin, because the structures weren't just closer, they were more numerous. They were arranged in a way that made the trail feel narrower than it had before, like it was being guided through them rather than simply passed by. At one point, I stopped and turned around to get a closer look at the path behind me. This is when that I notice I can't see the clearing anymore, not even a hint of it through the trees, even though I hadn't been walking long enough for it to be out of sight. For the first time in that day, I felt something close to panic. Not like full panic, not overwhelming, just enough to make the chest tighten and breathing shallow, and I had to stand there for a minute trying to force myself to think clearly, to remember that the trail had been straightforward on the way in, and that all I have to do is follow it back out. I kept moving. After another stretch of trail, I started to notice something else, something that didn't make sense on its own terms, which was that some of the structures which I had been looking at look almost identical to the ones I've already seen. Not similar, but identical. Same branches, angles, small breaks in one of the supports. Like I was passing the same piece more than once, and I tried to tell myself that these are only how they should be, that somehow they look alike, but there's a specific one I remember clearly with a frame which had 3 vertical supports and 1 diagonal brace that had a split near the base. And I passed it once, then a few minutes later, and then a third time after that. That was when I realised that the trail wasn't behaving the way it should, not in a dramatic way, not looping back on itself in a way I could map, but subtly, like the distance between points was shifting, like the path was folding in on itself, just enough to keep me moving without actually taking me where I expected to go. And I stopped again and pulled out my map and compass, not because I thought that would give me a perfect answer, but because I needed something concrete to hold on to. The compass needle was steady, pointing the way it always did, but the landmarks around me didn't match. Now, they were close enough that I convinced myself it was just the destiny of the forest or the lack there of clear sights, but off enough that I couldn't be sure of anything, and that uncertainty was starting to build into something heavier, something that makes every step feel like a guess instead of a decision. I chose a direction and started moving again, not following on the trail this time but cutting through the trees in what I knew should be the general direction of the maintenance path. And for a while it seemed to work. The structures are thinning out, the ground changing in ways that suggest I was moving away from the central area, but then I saw another one ahead of me, larger than the others, positioned between the trees in a way that made it look almost like a doorway, and without thinking I stepped towards it, because something about it felt like a point of exit, like if I passed through what I thought would be the correct direction I could get to the end of this. But instead I stopped now, just short of it, because at the last second I noticed the ground on the other side too was smooth, too flat, like it had been worn down by repeated movements, and there were no footprints, no tracks, nothing to explain the where, and the structure itself was different from the others, not just in size, but the way it was built. The branches bend inward instead of out, the angles converging instead of opening, like it was meant to draw something in rather than frame something out. I stepped back slowly. As I did, I felt something shift in the air around me. Not a sound, not a movement. I could see just a change in pressure, like the forest itself had adjusted in response to what had just been done. And that was enough to break whatever hesitation I had left. I turned around and moved quickly in the opposite direction, not running but fast enough that I'm really getting pace now. Pushing through the undergrowth, ignoring the trail entirely now, focusing only on putting distance between myself and that structure. And for a while it works, the trees thinning, the ground rising slightly and the air feeling more open, but then I heard something behind me again, the same kind of movement as before but closer this time. When I glanced back, I saw it. Not clearly, not in detail, just a shape between the trees. Upright. Still for a moment before shifting slightly. The way it moved didn't match the way that a person moves. Not in the joints, not in the timing, like it was adjusting itself rather than stepping. And even though it didn't make any sound that I knew, I could tell that I was being followed. And yeah, that's when I ran. I didn't try to stay quiet or careful. I just move as fast as I can through the trees, trusting that if I keep quiet and going in the correct direction, I would eventually break out of whatever pattern I'd been caught in. And for a while, I could still hear something behind me. Not footsteps, not branches breaking, just a sense of movement tracking mine, matching it. Just staying out of sight, and every time that I thought I put enough distance between us, I catch a glimpse of that shape again. Always in the same relative position, always between the trees, watching. Eventually the ground changed under my feet in a way that I recognise, the slope levelling out, the undergrowth thinning, the faint outline of the maintenance path reappearing ahead of me, and I stepped onto something, and I suddenly feel a release, not safety exactly, but a shift back into a set of rules I understood. And when I stopped, looking back, I realised that I need to open my eyes now and focus around me. I turn around and there's nothing there. Just the forest closing in behind me, the structure's gone and the path empty. I don't stop until I reach the bridge, or what was left of it, and from there, I kept going all the way back to the station without turning around again. I filed the report the next day, and I wrote it in the way that you're supposed to write these things, clear, factual, focused on what can be verified, the structures, the locations, and the lack of tool markers, the inconsistency in the trowel, and I left out the part about the shape, but there was no way to include that without turning the whole thing into something that wasn't supposed to be. The area was closed shortly after, officially due to unstable terrain and potential hazard from trail conditions, and no one was assigned to go back alone. As far as I know, the structures were removed and everything stops. And sometimes when I'm out on the trails in completely different parts of the park, I'll see something at the edge of the trees that looks a little too deliberate, a few branches which are arranged in a way that doesn't quite make sense, and I keep walking because I've learnt not to stop there. Now I thought it was over, but it wasn't. I started seeing them again, not in the valley, not near the closed trail, but in a completely different part of the park, scattered, small at first, also unnoticeable unless you're looking for them. A few branches lean together at angles that are too precise, sticks positioned that feel unnatural somehow, little formations that you could easily dismiss if you haven't seen something similar before, but I had. And once you recognise a pattern like this, you can't really get rid of it. I guess that's human nature, but you start seeing it everywhere. At first I tried to convince myself that's what it is, pattern recognition, the brain connecting things that aren't actually there. That stopped the day that I found one that I knew hadn't been there before. I was on a completely different trail, miles away from the valley, somewhere that I had walked just 2 days earlier, and the structure this time was unmistakable. I mean, 3 branches and the diagonal brace with a split near the base, exactly like the one I passed multiple times in the valley. Again, not similar but identical, but there was no footprints or disturbance. The moment I step closer to it, the feeling comes back. Not fear at first, just really like I'm aware. Like the forest had shifted and was paying attention in a way that it hadn't a second earlier. I stopped to really think about it, and that's when I hear it behind me. Not loud, not sudden, just something that hadn't been there before, and now I saw it. A figure between the trees and closer. Still not clear, not detailed, but there was no mistaking it now. Something shaped like a person, but wrong in a way that held itself. It was too still, too straight, like it didn't have the small movements that real bodies have when they're standing in place. It wasn't hiding, it wasn't approaching, it was just there facing me. I didn't move for a second. That's the part that bothers me most when I think about it, because there was a moment where I just stood there looking at it, and it felt like it was waiting for me to do something. Not threatening, not aggressive, just waiting. Like whatever it was depending on my next move. Though the thought never really crossed my mind to go towards it, so I'd go backwards, slowly. And when I did, it moved. Not forwards, not back, just adjusting, like correcting its position to stay aligned with me, always staring or facing directly at me. That was enough. I turned and started walking back the way I came, faster now, not yet running, but not slow. The feeling stays with me, constant, like something was matching my pace out of sight. Now, every time that I turned around, something in me tells me not to, like it would be closer, but when I reach the main junction, I catch my breath, and that's when I saw it next to the structure, right at the edge of the trail, facing my direction I've come from. It hadn't been there before, and I knew that. And in that moment, something clicked in place in a way that made things worse. They weren't random structures, they were placing them there in relation to me. They were tracking, mapping, and marking. I didn't stay to think about it, I left. Now, I wasn't really controlled anymore. I was just in a constant state of fear. I knew that I have to get out of there. But I realised that this thing's now standing at the very edge, almost like it understood a boundary where that I'd got into the opening finally. The realisation of this gives me enough courage that I can actually step out and get away. I feel the urge to run building again, but I feel a growing pressure like standing there was the worst possible choice. Every second that I stayed there, I gave it more time to adjust and to move closer possibly. I don't really understand what it's doing now. So I instead turn around, going quickly without breaking into a full sprint. For the first few seconds, I don't hear anything behind me. I think the boundary's been respected, and that silence is worse than if I heard it crashing after me, because it meant whatever it was decided that it didn't need to follow me and make noise and rush. It could move however it wanted and keep up still. And that thought was enough to push me into a run before I decided to. My steps were becoming uneven as I tried to balance with making all my best efforts not to fall over. I forced myself not to look back. Every instinct told me to check the distance to see if it was gaining, but something deeper told me to not look again because it would change, like the act of looking would bring it closer in a way that I can't undo. So I kept forward, focusing on the path on my next step, trying to turn to something mechanical that I can control at least. And that's when I heard it again, movement, not behind me but to my left now and close. I turned my head just enough to see them between the trees without looking fully. There's another. The shape, the stillness, moving in a natural way and stepping but not shifting, staying parallel to me as I ran, and another further ahead, on the right side of the trail, standing where I was going to be for a few seconds. That was when I fully panic. Now, I'm not controlled or measured, I just run as quick as I can, and veer off the trail without thinking, cutting through the undergrowth in a direction that felt like it would take me away from both of them. branches snapping against my arms, the ground underneath my feet giving way almost as I run. I don't know where I'm going anymore. The trail was gone behind me, and whatever sense of direction I had was breaking apart from the pressure, but it didn't matter, because the only thing that mattered in that moment was getting away from whatever was positioning itself around me. The forest really feels like it's closing in on me now. The trees tighter together, the space between them narrowing in a way that makes every movement harder, and that's when I realised it wasn't just one or two now. There were more. I could feel them before I saw them. The same presence multiplied, spread out through the trees in a way that made it impossible to focus on any single direction without feeling something like ours. Like they were just following me and surrounding me. I slowed down without meaning to, holding my pace as I tried to listen. To understand where they are, how many there are, and that's when I see them clearly for the first time. There's not 1, 2, 4, maybe more. Each one standing between trees spaced apart but connected by positioning, all facing me, all holding the same unnatural stillness. That was the worst part, how they seemed to adjust as I move, not stepping closer but shifting just enough to maintain the same relative distance, like I was at the center of something that was closing in without ever appearing to. I backed away slowly, turning in place, trying to find a gap, a direction that's not blocked, but every time I focused on one area, something there would shift. A figure becomes more visible, another stepping in view just enough to remove that option. That's when I realized I had stepped forwards, moving without realizing I had done so. I was just turning in a small space, reacting, letting them dictate where I could go. I decided to pick a direction, the most narrow gap between two trees where I could only see one of them instead of two, and I ran straight at it. For a second, it didn't move. I just stood there watching, and then, as I got closer, it shifted. Not away, not towards me, just enough to stay directly in my path. That's when I understood something I hadn't before. They weren't trying to block me. They were trying to make me choose, trying to make me commit to a direction, to see what I would do. I didn't slow down, I didn't change direction. I just kept running straight at it. And when I was close enough that I should have collided with it, it moved. Not stepping aside, not running. Just gone. Like it had never been there. But the space it occupied felt wrong as I passed through it, like the air itself was thicker for a split second. And as soon as I was past that point, I heard something behind me. I hear a sound, a moment. Not a footstep, a scream, short and sharp, close enough that it felt like it's come from behind me. I didn't look back, I couldn't, so instead I keep running. The forest opens up again after that. Now, that's when the trees seemed to be thinning and the ground levelling out, and I recognised the terrain just enough to know that I was heading towards the outer trails, towards areas which are maintained that people actually go. And that knowledge gave me just enough focus to keep moving without completely breaking down. By the time I reached the edge of the main trail, I was absolutely exhausted. I mean, how could I not be? I finally get to an area that I really recognise well and turn around, and I see nothing. No figures, no movement, no sound, just forest, still and empty. Like it had always been that way. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself it was over, that I made it out, that whatever had happened back there was tied to that section of forest and didn't extend beyond it. For a moment, I believed that. I sat down at the edge of the trail back against a tree, trying to catch my breath, trying to let the adrenaline settle, telling myself that I just needed a minute before heading back to the station and writing everything down. That's when I felt it again, the same shift, the same awareness. I look up slowly and they're there, not in the trees this time, on the trail around me, closer than they'd been ever before. Not one, not four, but more. I can't even count how many there are. They stood in a loose circle, spaced just far enough apart that I could see each of them clearly, all facing me, all holding the same unnatural stillness. The realization hits me all at once. I hadn't stayed in the forest. It had followed me out. I pushed myself to my feet immediately, my legs barely steady under me, For a second I froze again because there's no clear path to get out of here. But I didn't wait this time. I didn't think. I just chose a direction and ran, straight at the closest one. And just like before, it didn't move until the last possible second, and then it shifted, gone. And I pushed through the space without slowing down, forcing myself forward through the line, through the outer circle, not even stopping when I felt the same wrong pressure I had before. Behind me the scream again, louder this time and longer. Like a person, but different, not like anything I could explain. I didn't look back. I just kept running until the trail widens, until I could see the road ahead, until the world starts to feel real again, and I don't stop until I reach the station. Even then I didn't feel safe, because I understood something then I hadn't before. It wasn't tied to the place, it wasn't tied to the structures, it was tied to me, and the worst part is that even when I get back, everything's normal, but I know I can't report this to anyone. I was meant to be out there searching for somebody who got lost in the forest, and they tell me that they've already found them hours ago. They say why didn't it answer the radio, but the battery was flat, and apparently I'd been gone for hours, but it only felt like I'd been gone for maybe 20 minutes. It was really scary to me. I just couldn't explain what had happened. I didn't know what to do, so I got to my desk where I had to write up a report. I basically had to capture everything that happened, but that was the thing. I couldn't capture something that doesn't make sense and that nobody's going to believe. That would be superfluous. Instead, I sat there and just stared at the ceiling for probably 15 minutes. I really struggled to write anything, and in the end I just tried to report something that had happened to me long ago. A normal search where nothing happened. A time when the radio goes flat, you can't contact the team but you report nothing strange. I go and make a coffee for myself and I just stare out the window expecting those things to come back. I don't know what they are. I know that they're still probably going to be out there, and that haunts me. I sit there staring at my coffee for long enough that I make a decision, and one that I never turn back on. I have to quit the service. I have to quit the place. I just need to get away from it all. I can't bear the thought of being sent out there again and the same thing happening. But surely that's happened to other people before too. I checked through some of the archived reports, but I can't find anything even loosely similar to what happened to me, and that's really what scares me the most, to be honest. On the drive back home, I can't stop thinking about what happened that day. I get back home, and now I flash to now, 30 years later, and I still can't explain what happened that night. That was my last day that I ever worked with the service, and I still have nightmares about this place. These things. I still wake up in cold sweats over this. I'm not sure that I can ever get this out of my mind. I've been in search and rescue long enough to know that the reports which sound the simplest are usually the ones that go wrong the fastest. And when the call came through about a missing photographer in the Northern Reserve, it didn't raise any alarms at first, because people get lost, people take wrong turns, and people underestimate distance and daylight. Most of the time, we usually just find people within a couple of hours, cold, tired, embarrassed, but alive. And the only unusual detail in this case was the last known location wasn't on any marked trail. It was an old service access point which hasn't been opened for a number of years, somewhere off a forgotten ridge where maintenance crews used to store equipment before the area was left to grow back naturally. The missing person was called Daniel Hurst, 36, freelance photographer, known for hiking into remote areas to try and get some landscape shots, which meant he wasn't completely inexperienced, but also meant he was likely to push further than most people would. The only reason anybody noticed is that his red car has been left there for too long. Engine cold, gear inside, no sign of him nearby. I was assigned with one other ranger to sweep the ridgeline before the full team moved in, just to check the obvious routes, the places someone might go for a view or shot, and the hike up was uneventful, quiet and normal. The kind of quiet that makes you forget you're looking for something serious. Until we find the first camera. It was sitting on a rock, not dropped, not abandoned, but placed. Lens pointed towards the trees, tripod extended, but no person. We checked it immediately, hoping it would give us some direction, and the battery still had enough power to review the images. And the first few were exactly like you'd expect. They were nature landscape shots, tree lines, sky through branches, but nothing unusual. But then the sequence changes. The photos start repeating the same scene, the same patch of forest, the same angle, the same frame. Everything except something in the background of each one. At first it was hard to notice. Just a shape, a vertical form between trees, and then closer and then clearer. A statue, stone, human-shaped, standing among the trees facing the camera. The first image was the same composition, but the statue was no longer in the background. It was just outside of the frame, close enough that you could see the edge of something pale in the corner of the image. We don't say anything for a moment. My partner then slowly turns and looks into the trees behind us. There was nothing there. We marked the location, radio it in, and continued along the ridge. But from that point on, everything feels different. Not in a way that I could explain at the time, just like a subtle shift in awareness, like something had been introduced into the environment which didn't belong there. Once you notice something like that, it's impossible to ignore. We found the statue about 20 minutes later. It stood just off the ridge, partially hidden by trees, exactly where the photo suggested it would be. Seeing it in person was completely different. Now, we found the statue about 20 minutes later, standing just off the ridge between two narrow trees, positioned in a way that made it impossible to see clearly until you're almost level with it. And even then, it didn't look right at first. Not because of what it was, but because of how it stood. Slightly angled forward like it had been leaning in motion and then stopped mid-step. Carved in pale stone that didn't match anything native to the area. Too smooth in some places, but too weathered in others, like it had been exposed for years and also placed there at a time not too long ago. I remembered seeing the thing, and it doesn't really make sense where it is, because hauling something that size up the ridge would have taken equipment, planning, multiple people, and there were no signs of any of that. No drag marks, no disturbed ground, no tracks. Just the statue itself standing on bare earth as though it had always been there. The second thing that didn't make sense was the expression, because it wasn't neutral, it wasn't decorative, it was worn down, enough to lose detail, looking deliberate, like whoever made it wanted it to look like it was watching something. We circled back slowly, keeping distance without really discussing why. At first I noticed the face wasn't just pointed in a general direction, it was aligned exactly towards the trail ridge, the direction we come from, and that detail stuck with me more than anything else because it meant it wasn't random placement, it was positioned to face movement, to face whoever was approaching from that path. And when I looked back towards where we had found the camera, I had the sudden, uncomfortable thought that it hadn't always been standing in this exact spot. My partner checks the ground around it, crouching low, running his hand over the soil like he expected to find something just hidden beneath the surface, but there was nothing. No sign it had been moved, no indentation beyond where you'd expect to be there from its weight. And that contradiction started to build into something harder to ignore, because it had either been there long enough for the ground to settle around it, or it had been placed recently without leaving any trace at all. We radioed in the find and we're told to hold position until the rest of the team arrived, which should have been reassuring, but standing there with that thing just a few feet away made waiting feel like the worst possible option. Without saying it aloud, we both shifted slightly so that we weren't standing directly in front of it anymore. It was like an instinct telling us not to stay in its line of sight. The forest around us stayed quiet. Not unnaturally silent, but subdued in a way that made every sound stand out more than it should have. The rustling of leaves, the distant movement of branches, and every time something shifted in my peripheral vision, I felt the urge to turn and check, to make sure nothing else appeared without me noticing, because by that point, the idea that something could move without leaving evidence didn't feel impossible anymore. Now, it happened when I looked away, not for long, just long enough to answer a radio call and turn my head slightly towards my partner. When I looked back, the statue wasn't exactly in the same position. It didn't move far, just a few inches, but enough. The angle had changed, and the weight shifted forward, the line on its shoulders no longer matching the way that it had been standing seconds before. And I knew immediately that I hadn't misremembered it, because I'd been staring at it too closely for too long for something like that to happen. Neither of us said anything at first, but we just stood there, both looking at it, both of us trying to convince ourselves that there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe the ground shifted, maybe the light changed the perception of its shape, maybe something had fallen behind it that we hadn't noticed, but none of that really helped us. My partner was the first to go back a little bit, just a step, not quickly, not dramatically, just one step. As soon as he did, I felt something change again, not in the statue itself, but in the space around it, like the air had tightened slightly, like something had responded to that movement in a way that we couldn't see directly. We didn't wait for the rest of the team after that. We started moving back towards the ridge path again, not running, not yet, but faster than before. Both of us kept seeing the statue in view as long as we could, neither of us willing to turn our backs on it completely, and for a moment it stayed where it was, unchanged and still, exactly as it had been when we stepped away. But after I looked away and then back again, it was closer, not halfway, but not suddenly in front of us, just a tiny bit closer, enough to remove any doubt, not enough to break whatever hesitation I had left, but we ran. Not thinking about the direction or procedure or anything else, just moving as fast as we could along the ridge, keeping the path in front of us, not looking back, because by then we both understood the same thing without needing to say it. That thing changed position. The trail felt longer than it had before, stretching in ways that didn't match the map in my head, every turn taking too long, every straight section feeling like it should have ended already. The sound behind us stayed quiet, long enough to be uncertain, like something was there, which was choosing not to be heard. We didn't stop until we reached the main junction. As we finally do, we both turned in time. Nothing behind us. No statue, no movement, no sign that anything had followed. For a second, we almost felt relief, until I noticed something on the edge of the path. Another one, smaller, but the same. Same stone, same shape, same leaning forward posture, facing the direction we'd come from. It hadn't been there before. I knew it hadn't. And that was a fear, and it shifted from something distant to something immediate, because it hadn't been just one. Now whatever it was moving, or there were more of them. Either way, it meant the same thing. We weren't ahead of it anymore. We were now inside of whatever it was doing. We didn't stop again. We kept moving down the main trail faster now, not caring who we ran into or how stupid we looked. Just focused on getting back to the Ranger Road, back to a place where there were more people, more noise and more structure. Anything that felt like it belonged to the world we understood. But as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't behind us anymore. It didn't need to be, because if it could appear ahead of us once, it could do it again. And the next time, we might not have enough distance left to react. I didn't look back again after that. I didn't need to, because I understood the part that mattered. It doesn't want to chase you. It doesn't need to. It just moves when you're not looking. So we kept moving down the trail faster than either of us wanted to admit, not speaking or looking at each other, because there was an unspoken understanding that if we stopped to process what just happened, we might not be able to keep moving at all. And the longer we stayed in that section of forest, the worse it felt. Like the distance alone wasn't enough anymore. Like whatever it was applying rules to us that couldn't be broken. After a while, the trail section widened and led to another of the older service roads that should have been the point where things start to feel safe, where the trees thinned out enough that visibility returns and the sense of being enclosed dropped away, but it didn't. Because with more space, the pressure stayed with us, and with that, the awareness that something didn't need cover or darkness to be near. We slowed slightly when the main road came into view, not because we felt safe, but because exhaustion was starting to catch up, and I remembered thinking that if we could get onto the road, just get into open ground, it would break whatever this was, like stepping out of one environment into another, resetting us to feeling normal. Now, we didn't speak after stepping onto that service road, not because there was nothing to say, but we were both listening for sounds that come. Now, we want confirmation that it wasn't just in our heads, and the silence stretches out again for far too long, but the silence around us is too empty to compare to the forest that we've just been in. Strange. Now, my colleague was the first to break it, voice low, asking me if he'd seen the movement. The fact that he didn't try and explain it, didn't laugh it off or frame it as a trick of light, told me everything I needed to know about what we'd seen, because I hadn't really said enough about what had just happened. I told him I haven't seen the movement exactly, but I knew that this thing changed position and was facing me, and he nodded, looking at me. Our eyes are fixed on the road ahead. Saying it like that aloud made it more real than either of us wanted to admit. And for a few seconds, neither of us said anything. The road should have been a relief, like solid ground and mapped and familiar, but the further we walk, the more it felt like a corridor instead, something narrowing our options rather than giving us a way out. My colleague has glanced to the side once more, not stepping off the asphalt, just checking the tree line like he expected something to be standing there waiting. I remember the camera then and explain about it and the photos we've recovered. How the figure's there in every shot and how it got in closer without him noticing. My colleague speaks again, but slower now. I explain what happened and he also verifies it was exactly the same for him. Now, I looked through the camera and the photos, and I passed it over to watch his expression change as he scrolled, the same way mine had. It shifted from confusion to recognition to something quieter and more focused, like he was trying to find a shift in it, something to make it more predictable and controllable, and when he reaches the last image, he stops. It's one that I hadn't noticed before. Staring at it longer, his grip tightens around the device slightly. He turned the screen towards me without saying anything, and I already knew what he was looking at. The final shot, the one I'd missed before, the statue too close to the angle wrong, and those prints alongside the photographer's varf matching him step for step. My colleague exhaled slowly, shaking his head just for once and passing the camera back. He said it was following him before he even notices, that it didn't need him to look at it to move, just to not realize it was there, and the way he said it made something click into place for me, because it lined up with everything we'd seen so far, the way it had repositioned itself when we weren't directly focused on it, the way it seemed to stay just outside the center of whatever it was looking at, until it was too close to ignore. We kept walking now, faster after that, not running, but going a lot quicker than we had been, pretending that it was a normal patrol. I could feel the tension building again, not from anything we could see, but from the expectation of it. The knowledge that whatever was there and whatever we'd left behind wasn't staying there, it was somehow connected. My colleague suddenly stopped, his hand coming up just enough to signal it, and then I froze with him. Following his line of sight down to the ground was a thin layer of dust where the road had been disturbed. Not in a random pattern, not like wind or animals moving through, but deliberate impressions running alongside our own tracks, There were two sets, one matches mine exactly and the other his. Neither of us said anything for a second, but the understanding passes between us anyway, because there was no way to interpret that as anything else other than what it was. We crouched down slightly, not touching the prints, studying them. We trace a pattern forward with our eyes. Standing up slowly, we know we need to keep moving. Stopping wasn't helping, and I didn't argue, because the longer we stayed, the more it felt like we were given whatever this was time to adjust and get closer. So we start walking again. Both of us more aware now of how every step we took looked, the prints we take. Now, it didn't matter how we adjust our stride, how we sped up or slowed down, they match us exactly, forming beside our own tracks as if something invisible was just out of reach. And I catch my colleague looking down more often now, not out of curiosity, but to confirm that they were still there, still following the same impossible pattern. We reach a bend in the road and slowly and instinctively turn because we feel something before we even see it. The same subtle presence in the air, the sense of something being deliberately put in our path again. And we came around the curve and it come into our view again, the statue, just off the centre of the road. Closer than it had been in the clearing, now facing us. Harris didn't hesitate this time, didn't question it or try and explain it away. He just stopped and locked his eyes onto it, and I did the same, because by then it was obvious whatever rules applied here, they had just done something. Now, this thing was not there a moment ago. There was no way it could have gotten ahead of us without passing first, and yet here it is, positioned perfectly to block the road, forcing us to either confront it directly or to step back into the trees where we have less control. My colleague spoke now without looking away, his voice steady but tight, saying that we shouldn't both look away at the same time, and that if we both left it unobserved, I'm pretty sure it's going to move. I nodded, because the logic made sense in a way that nothing else did, and for a few seconds we just stood there, watching it, waiting to see if it would react, but it didn't, not visibly. But something about it felt different, like the distance between us wasn't fixed, like it was already closer than it was the first time we had seen it. I could feel the strain building in my eyes from holding focus on it, the instinct to blink become harder to ignore every second that passes. Harris told me to move sideways, slowly, to see if we can go around it without breaking the line of sight, and I did, stepping carefully to the right, keeping my gaze locked on the statue as I shifted position. And for a second, for a moment nothing changed. The statue remained still, its posture unchanged. Then Harris inhaled sharply. I didn't ask why. I could sense it too. It had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have been obvious if you weren't already watching for it, but enough that its orientation had changed, that it was no longer facing where we'd originally been standing, but where it had moved to. Its entire form subtly adjusted to keep itself aligned with me. We both froze, both of us understanding that at the same time, it wasn't just reacting for being observed, it was tracking us individually. Now I don't know what to do. It's adjusting on our positions. My colleague had then said quietly that we need to test something, that he was going to look away for a second while I kept my eyes on it. I told him to wait, that we didn't know what would happen if either of us broke focus, but he shook his head slightly, saying we needed to know because if both of us had to maintain eye contact at all times, then we weren't going to make it back like this. He counted under his breath, 3, 2, 1, and then looked away. For a fraction of a second, I thought that nothing had changed and that this is still in the same position, but then I noticed the angle of its head, the slight shift in its arm, the way its weight seemed to have redistributed, and I realized that it's moved, not fully, but just closing the distance slightly, enough to confirm what we're afraid of. It didn't need both of us to look away, just one. And my colleague snapped his gaze back onto it immediately, and for a second neither of us moved at all. The weight of what had just happened settled in, because the small shift changes everything. It meant we couldn't rely on the simplest rule that we thought we understood. It meant the margin for error was smaller than either of us had assumed. I could see it in his posture. He was recalculating just as fast as I was, trying to find a way through that didn't end with one of us looking away at the wrong time. He said quietly that we need to move together, that if we tracked individuals and separating even slightly might give it an opening. I agreed without hesitation, stepping closer to him until we realized that we're almost shoulder to shoulder, keeping eyes fixed on this thing as we begin shifting sideways along the road with slow, deliberate steps, testing whether we could get around it without giving it the chance to close in further. For a few seconds it seems to hold position, and I felt a flicker of something closer to hope, because the distance between us and the edge of the road was shrinking. The tree line was opening just enough so that we think we're able to pass it without stepping back into the forest. But then my colleague mutters under his breath, and I knew before he registered anything. The statue moved again, adjusting, not forward, not closing the gap, but rotating very slightly, angling itself to no matter how we moved. It remained centered facing us, keeping the same fixed distance. It was correcting the path in real time, and then the realization settled in that we weren't going to go around it at all. We're being guided and redirected in a line that's controlled. My colleague said that we need to break the pattern, that staying predictable was given too much control. Neither of us knew what to do here. Now, it was obvious we were going to be stuck here for a long time potentially. Now we continue on. We didn't lose it all at once, and that's what made it worse, because after this moment and forcing myself to look down, I think I understand the rules. Like, I could survive as long as I kept my attention fixed, as long as we don't make the same mistake. But the longer that I moved on now, after we split up, the more the uncertainty— what the fuck? I've been in search and rescue long enough to know that the reports which sound the simplest are usually the ones that go wrong the fastest. And when the call came through about a missing photographer in the Northern Reserve, it didn't raise any alarms at first, because people get lost, people take wrong turns, and people underestimate distance and daylight. Most of the time, we usually just find people within a couple of hours, cold, tired, embarrassed, but alive. And the only unusual detail in this case was the last known location wasn't on any marked trail. It was an old service access point which hasn't been opened for a number of years, somewhere off a forgotten ridge where maintenance crews used to store equipment before the area was left to grow back naturally. The missing person was called Daniel Hurst, 36, freelance photographer, known for hiking into remote areas to try and get some landscape shots, which meant he wasn't completely inexperienced, but also meant he was likely to push further than most people would. The only reason anybody noticed is that his red car has been left there for too long. Engine cold, gear inside, no sign of him nearby. I was assigned with one other ranger to sweep the ridgeline before the full team moved in, just to check the obvious routes, the places someone might go for a view or shot, and the hike up was uneventful, quiet and normal. The kind of quiet that makes you forget you're looking for something serious, until we find the first camera. It was sitting on a rock, not dropped, not abandoned, but placed. Lens pointed towards the trees, tripod extended, but no person. We checked it immediately, hoping it would give us some direction, and the battery still had enough power to review the images, and the first few were exactly like you'd expect. They were nature landscape shots, tree lines, sky through branches, but nothing unusual. But then the sequence changes. The photos start repeating the same scene, the same patch of forest, the same angle, the same frame. Everything except something in the background of each one. At first it was hard to notice. Just a shape, a vertical form between trees, and then closer and then clearer. A statue, stone, human-shaped, standing among the trees facing the camera. The first image was the same composition, but the statue was no longer in the background. It was just outside of the frame, close enough that you could see the edge of some pink pal in the corner of the image. We don't say anything for a moment. My partner then slowly turns and looks into the trees behind us. There was nothing there. We marked the location, radio it in, and continued along the ridge. But from that point on, everything feels different. Not in a way that I could explain at the time, just like a subtle shift in awareness, like something had been introduced into the environment which didn't belong there. Once you notice something like that, it's impossible to ignore. We found the statue about 20 minutes later. It stood just off the ridge, partially hidden by trees, exactly where the photo suggested it would be. Seeing it in person was completely different. Now, we found the statue about 20 minutes later, standing just off the ridge between two narrow trees, positioned in a way that made it impossible to see clearly until you're almost level with it. And even then, it didn't look right at first. Not because of what it was, but because of how it stood, slightly angled forward like it had been leaning in motion and then stopped mid-step, carved in pale stone that didn't match anything native to the area. Too smooth in some places, but too weathered in others, like it had been exposed for years and also placed there at a time not too long ago. I remembered seeing the thing, and it doesn't really make sense where it is, because hauling something that size up the ridge would have taken equipment, planning, multiple people, and there were no signs of any of that. No drag marks, no disturbed ground, no tracks. Just the statue itself standing on bare earth as though it had always been there. The second thing that didn't make sense was the expression, because it wasn't neutral, it wasn't decorative, it was worn down, enough to lose detail, looking deliberate, like whoever made it wanted it to look like it was watching something. We circled back slowly, keeping distance without really discussing why. At first I noticed the face wasn't just pointed in a general direction, it was aligned exactly towards the trail ridge, the direction we come from, and that detail stuck with me more than anything else because it meant it wasn't random placement, it was positioned to face movement, to face whoever was approaching from that path. And when I looked back towards where we had found the camera, I had the sudden, uncomfortable thought that it hadn't always been standing in this exact spot. My partner checks the ground around it, crouching low, running his hand over the soil like he expected to find something just hidden beneath the surface, but there was nothing. No sign it had been moved, no indentation beyond where you'd expect to be there from its weight. And that contradiction started to build into something harder to ignore, because it had either been there long enough for the ground to settle around it, or it had been placed recently without leaving any trace at all. We radioed in the find and we're told to hold position until the rest of the team arrived, which should have been reassuring, but standing there with that thing just a few feet away made waiting feel like the worst possible option. Without saying it aloud, we both shifted slightly so that we weren't standing directly in front of it anymore. It was like an instinct telling us not to stay in its line of sight. The forest around us stayed quiet, not unnaturally silent, but subdued in a way that made every sound stand out more than it should have. The rustling of leaves, the distant movement of branches, and every time something shifted in my peripheral vision, I felt the urge to turn and check, to make sure nothing else appeared without me noticing, because by that point, the idea that something could move without leaving evidence didn't feel impossible anymore. Now, it happened when I looked away, not for long, just long enough to answer a radio call and turn my head slightly towards my partner. When I looked back, the statue wasn't exactly in the same position. It didn't move far, just a few inches, but enough. The angle had changed, and the weight shifted forward, the line on its shoulders no longer matching the way that it had been standing seconds before. And I knew immediately that I hadn't misremembered it because I'd been staring at it too closely for too long for something like that to happen. Neither of us said anything at first, but we just stood there, both looking at it, Both of us trying to convince ourselves that there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe the ground shifted, maybe the light changed the perception of its shape, maybe something had fallen behind it that we hadn't noticed, but none of that really helped us. My partner was the first to go back a little bit. Just a step. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just one step. As soon as he did, I felt something change again. Not in the statue itself, but in the space around it, like the air had tightened slightly. Like something had responded to that movement in a way that we couldn't see directly. We didn't wait for the rest of the team after that. We started moving back towards the ridge path again. Not running, not yet, but faster than before. Both of us kept seeing the statue in view as long as we could, neither of us willing to turn our backs on it completely, and for a moment it stayed where it was, unchanged and still, exactly as it had been when we stepped away. But after I looked away and then back again, it was closer, not halfway, but not suddenly in front of us, just a tiny bit closer, enough to remove any doubt, not enough to break whatever hesitation I had left, but we ran. Not thinking about the direction or procedure or anything else, just moving as fast as we could along the ridge, keeping the path in front of us, not looking back, because by then we both understood the same thing without needing to say it. That thing changed position. The trail felt longer than it had before, stretching in ways that didn't match the map in my head, every turn taking too long, every straight section feeling like it should have ended already. The sound behind us stayed quiet, long enough to be uncertain, like something was there, which was choosing not to be heard. We didn't stop until we reached the main junction. As we finally do, we both turned in time. Nothing behind us. No statue, no movement, no sign that anything had followed. For a second, we almost felt relief, until I noticed something on the edge of the path. Another one, smaller, but the same. Same stone, same shape, same leaning forward posture, facing the direction we'd come from. It hadn't been there before. I knew it hadn't. And that was a fear, and it shifted from something distant to something immediate, because it hadn't been just one. Now whatever it was moving, or there were more of them. Either way, it meant the same thing. We weren't ahead of it anymore. We were now inside of whatever it was doing. We didn't stop again. We kept moving down the main trail faster now, not caring who we ran into or how stupid we looked. Just focused on getting back to the Ranger Road, back to a place where there were more people, more noise and more structure. Anything that felt like it belonged to the world we understood. But as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't behind us anymore. It didn't need to be, because if it could appear ahead of us once, it could do it again. And the next time, we might not have enough distance left to react. I didn't look back again after that. I didn't need to, because I understood the part that mattered. It doesn't want to chase you. It doesn't need to. It just moves when you're not looking. So we kept moving down the trail faster than either of us wanted to admit, not speaking or looking at each other, because there was an unspoken understanding that if we stopped to process what just happened, we might not be able to keep moving at all. And the longer we stayed in that section of forest, the worse it felt. Like the distance alone wasn't enough anymore. Like whatever it was applying rules to us that couldn't be broken. After a while, the trail section widened and led to another of the older service roads that should have been the point where things start to feel safe, where the trees thinned out enough that visibility returns and the sense of being enclosed dropped away, but it didn't. Because with more space, the pressure stayed with us, and with that, the awareness that something didn't need cover or darkness to be near. We slowed slightly when the main road came into view, not because we felt safe, but because exhaustion was starting to catch up, and I remembered thinking that if we could get onto the road, just get into open ground, it would break whatever this was. Like stepping out of one environment into another, resetting us to feeling normal. Now we didn't speak after stepping onto that service road, not because there was nothing to say, but we were both listening for sounds that come. Now, We want confirmation that it wasn't just in our heads, and the silence stretches out again for far too long, but the silence around us is too empty to compare to the forest that we've just been in. Strange. Now, my colleague was the first to break it, voice low, asking me if he'd seen the movement. The fact that he didn't try and explain it, didn't laugh it off or frame it as a trick of light, told me everything I needed to know about what we'd seen, because I hadn't really said enough about what had just happened. I told him I hadn't seen the movement exactly, but I knew that this thing changed position and was facing me, and he nodded, looking at me. Our eyes are fixed on the road ahead. Saying it like that aloud made it more real than either of us wanted to admit. And for a few seconds, neither of us said anything. The road should have been a relief, like solid ground and mapped and familiar, but the further we walk, the more it felt like a corridor instead, something narrowing our options rather than giving us a way out. My colleague has glanced to the side once more, not stepping off the asphalt, just checking the tree line like he expected something to be standing there waiting. I remembered the camera then and explain about it and the photos we've recovered. How the figure's there in every shot and how it got in closer without him noticing. My colleague speaks again, but slower now. I explain what happened and he also verifies it was exactly the same for him. Now, I looked through the camera and the photos, and I passed it over to watch his expression change as he scrolled, the same way mine had. It shifted from confusion to recognition to something quieter and more focused, like he was trying to find a shift in it, something to make it more predictable and controllable, and when he reaches the last image, he stops. It's one that I hadn't noticed before. Staring at it longer, his grip tightens around the device slightly. He turned the screen towards me without saying anything, and I already knew what he was looking at. The final shot, the one I'd missed before, the statue too close to the angle wrong, and those prints alongside the photographer's farth matching him step for step. My colleague exhaled slowly, shaking his head just for once and passing the camera back. He said it was following him before he even notices, that it didn't need him to look at it to move, just to not realize it was there. And the way he said it made something click into place for me, because it lined up with everything we'd seen so far. The way it had repositioned itself when we weren't directly focused on it, the way it seemed to stay just outside the center of whatever it was looking at, until it was too close to ignore. We kept walking now, faster after that, not running, but going a lot quicker than we had been, pretending that it was a normal patrol. I could feel the tension building again, not from anything we could see, but from the expectation of it. The knowledge that whatever was there and whatever we'd left behind wasn't staying there, it was somehow connected. My colleague suddenly stopped, his hand coming up just enough to signal it, and then I froze with him. Following his line of sight down to the ground was a thin layer of dust where the road had been disturbed. Not in a random pattern, not like wind or animals moving through, but deliberate impressions running alongside our own tracks. There were two sets, one matches mine exactly and the other his. Neither of us said anything for a second, but the understanding passes between us anyway, because there was no way to interpret that as anything else other than what it was. We crouched down slightly, not touching the prints, studying them. We trace a pattern forward with our eyes. Standing up slowly, we know we need to keep moving. Stopping wasn't helping, and I didn't argue, because the longer we stayed, the more it felt like we were giving whatever this was time to adjust and get closer. So we start walking again. Both of us more aware now of how every step we took looked, the prints we take. Now, it didn't matter how we adjust our stride, how we sped up or slowed down, they match us exactly, forming besides our own tracks as if something invisible was just out of reach. And I catch my colleague looking down more often now, not out of curiosity, but to confirm that they were still there, still following the same impossible pattern. We reach a bend in the road and slowly and instinctively turn because we feel something before we even see it. The same subtle presence in the air, the sense of something being deliberately put in our path again. And we came around the curve and it come into our view again. The statue, just off the centre of the road. Closer than it had been in the clearing, now facing us. Harris didn't hesitate this time, didn't question it or try and explain it away. He just stopped and locked his eyes onto it, and I did the same. Because by then, it was obvious whatever rules applied here, they had just done something. Now, this thing was not there a moment ago. There was no way it could have gotten ahead of us without passing first, and yet here it is, positioned perfectly to block the road, forcing us to either confront it directly or to step back into the trees where we have less control. My colleague spoke now without looking away, his voice steady but tight, saying that we shouldn't both look away at the same time, and that if we both left it unobserved, I'm pretty sure it's going to move. I nodded, because the logic made sense in a way that nothing else did, and for a few seconds we just stood there, watching it, waiting to see if it would react, but it didn't, not visibly. But something about it felt different, like the distance between us wasn't fixed, like it was already closer than it was the first time we had seen it. I could feel the strain building in my eyes from holding focus on it, the instinct to blink become harder to ignore every second that passes. Harris told me to move sideways, slowly, to see if we can go around it without breaking the line of sight, and I did, stepping carefully to the right, keeping my gaze locked on the statue as I shifted position. And for a second, for a moment nothing changed. The statue remained still, its posture unchanged. Then Harris inhaled sharply. I didn't ask why. I could sense it too. It had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have been obvious if you weren't already watching for it, but enough that its orientation had changed, that it was no longer facing where we'd originally been standing, but where it had moved to, its entire form subtly adjusted to keep itself aligned with me. We both froze, both of us understanding that at the same time, it wasn't just reacting for being observed, it was tracking us individually. Now I don't know what to do. It's adjusting on our positions. My colleague had then said quietly that we need to test something, that he was going to look away for a second while I kept my eyes on it. I told him to wait, that we didn't know what would happen if either of us broke focus, but he shook his head slightly, saying we needed to know because if both of us had to maintain eye contact at all times, then we weren't going to make it back like this. He counted under his breath, 3, 2, 1, and then looked away. For a fraction of a second, I thought that nothing had changed and that this is still in the same position, but then I noticed the angle of its head, the slight shift in its arm, the way its weight seemed to have redistributed, and I realized that it's moved, not fully, but just closing the distance slightly, enough to confirm what we're afraid of. It didn't need both of us to look away, just one. My colleague snapped his gaze back onto it immediately, and for a second neither of us moved at all. The weight of what had just happened settled in, because the small shift changes everything. It meant we couldn't rely on the simplest rule that we thought we understood. It meant the margin for error was smaller than either of us had assumed. I could see it in his posture. He was recalculating just as fast as I was, trying to find a way through that didn't end with one of us looking away at the wrong time. He said quietly that we need to move together, that if we tracked individuals then separating even slightly might give it an opening. I agreed without hesitation, stepping closer to him until we realized that we're almost shoulder to shoulder, keeping eyes fixed on this thing as we begin shifting sideways along the road with slow deliberate steps, testing whether we could get around it without giving it the chance to close in further. For a few seconds it seems to hold position, and I felt a flicker of something closer to hope, because the distance between us and the edge of the road was shrinking. The tree line was opening just enough so that we think we're able to pass it without stepping back into the forest. But then my colleague mutters under his breath, and I knew before he registered. anything. The statue moved again, adjusting, not forward, not closing the gap, but rotating very slightly, angling itself to no matter how we moved. It remained centered facing us, keeping the same fixed distance. It was correcting the path in real time, and then the realization settled in that we weren't going to go around it at all. We're being guided and redirected in a line that's controlled. My colleague said that we need to break the pattern, that staying predictable was given too much control. Neither of us knew what to do here. Now, it was obvious we were going to be stuck here for a long time potentially. Now we continue on. We didn't lose it all at once, and that's what made it worse, because after this moment and forcing myself to look down, I think I understand the rules. Like, I could survive as long as I kept my attention fixed, as long as we don't make the same mistake. But the longer that I moved on now, after we split up, the more the uncertainty. What the fuck? I'd been working search and rescue for about 9 years before the Cinderidge incident. In all that time, I've seen enough terrible things in the woods that would stop you believing in the clean, comforting vision of nature that people talk about and put on postcards. The forest can be beautiful, yes, but it's not always that kind. It doesn't care if you're lost, injured, cold and thirsty, old, young, experienced or not, or stupid. It doesn't care if your family is waiting at a trailhead with blankets and flashlights and hope. It doesn't care if you scream until your throat hurts. It will keep you standing around in the dark, patient and silent, while you become smaller and smaller. That was a mindset I had by late August, when the fire season had already stretched everyone thin and the whole district smelt permanently of smoke. Even on clear days, the sun came through the haze as a dull orange coin, and every dry leaf on the ground looked like it was waiting for permission to burn. We had already had 3 small lighting fires that month. Now, 2 illegal campfires that got out of control, and 1 abandoned truck found smouldering near the road access points. Nobody slept properly during fire season. You kept one ear out for the phone. You watched the horizon without noticing it. You smell smoke where there's none. The first call came in around 5:42 in the evening, just as the light was beginning to turn copper behind the ridge. A family had reported a missing hiker named Nathan Brooks, 34 years old, and confident enough to be experienced, but not confident enough to actually be safe out there. He had set out alone that morning on a hike on the old Cinderidge loop, a closed route that had not been officially maintained for years because of washouts, deadfall, and unstable slopes. His sister had texted around noon, saying that he could see smoke somewhere above the drainage and was going to go and get a few photos before heading back. After that, nothing. On its own, that would have been enough to send us out. A missing person, a closed trail, late summer heat, and possible smoke in the high country are not things that you waited on. But then dispatch received the first 911 call from Nathan himself. The signal was weak, the line drops twice, the operator could barely make out what he was saying over static and wind. According to the transcript, he said that he'd gone off the trail after seeing what he thought was a small ground fire burning in a hollow ridge below. He said the fire looked strange, and he said that there's people outside of it, standing there. The last part got passed around quietly. Nobody put it in the official briefing with any drama. Heat exhaustion does strange things to people. Smoke inhalation does stranger. If Nathan had stumbled near a fire, panicked and breathed too much smoke and could become disorientated, he might have seen something like shadows, smoke, human shapes. I don't know. We all knew it. We all accepted that because it let us move. The problem was that no one could see the fire or find it. By the time I arrived in that area, and near the North Service Gate, 2 engines from the Forestry Service are already there, along with a county deputy, our district supervisor, and 3 other rangers from Search and Rescue. Everybody kept looking towards Cinderidge, expecting to see a smoke column. There was nothing obvious, so just the usual dirt haze hanging over the tree loops and the low sun bleeding through it. The wind was light, the air was dry enough to crack your lips. Every few minutes, somebody would lift a pair of binoculars and scan the ridgeline again, as if a fire might politely reveal itself if we stared hard enough. My partner that evening was Ranger Caleb Voss, a man I trusted more than almost anyone in the district. Caleb was not a dramatic, easily spooked person, and not careless. He had a calm, methodical personality that you want beside you in the woods when they start turning against you. He had been a smoke jumper before joining the park service, and if there was one thing he understood better than anybody else in our team, it was fire. He could look at the shape of a slope and tell you how the flames would climb it. He could smell the difference between green wood, dry bush, and old stuff burning underground. If he said a place was dangerous, you didn't argue. So he was standing by the hood of the command truck when I got there, studying a topo map with a crease between his eyebrows. He had drawn a circle around the last estimated ping from Nathan's phone, and the wider one around the stretch of drainage below Cinderidge. His finger rested on an old feature marked only as Burn Scar 1978, and I knew the place. Everybody in that district did, even though the visitors did not. It was a steep bowl of second growth pine and blackened snags left from a fire decades earlier, a place where the soil still turns up charcoal if you kick hard enough. Caleb did not look up when I joined him. He just said, "If he saw fire down there, we should be seeing smoke by now." "Could be a campfire," I said. "Maybe a small one under a canopy." He said no, not in that bowl. Not with this fuel load. If something took off down there, we'd know. I looked towards the ridge. The forest seemed still but not peaceful. In that dry orange light, every branch looks brittle, every shadow looks like it has depth. And somewhere high above us, a raven called once and then went quiet again. The plan was simple, because search plans are usually that way at the start, before the land begins complicating them. 2 teams would sweep the lower access trails and the drainage crossings. Caleb would take the old Cinderidge route from the north, cut towards Nathan's last phone thing, check the Burn Scar bowl before dark. The forestry would remain staged unless we confirmed it was an active fire. We had radios, GPS, a medical kit, headlamps, fire shelters, and enough experience between us to know that none of this would have made us invincible. Before we left, dispatch played the 911 recording to us from the command truck. It was short, maybe about 40 seconds of actual usable audio, which isn't much. Now, most of it was wind and static, but Nathan's voice came through thin and broken, a man trying not to sound terrified and failing badly. He said that he had lost the trail. He said that he could smell burning hair. He said the fire was not spreading right. Then the operator asked him to repeat the location, and Nathan said, "They're still standing in it." Someone in the group made a low, uncomfortable sound. The supervisor glances at Caleb and then at me, as if daring us to react. Nobody did though. Search and rescue teaches you to put fear into a box until later, though the box does not always hold, but you try. The recording continued. The operator asked who was standing in it. Nathan didn't answer straight away. When he did though, his voice dropped into almost a whisper saying, "They don't burn all the way." Then the call cuts out. We started up the trail at 6:18, moving fast but not recklessly. The first mile was easy though, a dry switchback climb through pine and fir, with dust rising in our boots and the smell of warm resin thick in the air. The trail had been closed off officially, but people still used it. The fresh footprints are in place and a ton of energy packets and scuff marks of terrain poles. Nathan had likely come this way. At first that made me feel better. Evidence always does. It gives the mind something solid to hold on to. The higher we climb, the more the forest changes. The healthy green understory thinned out, replaced by dry dead branches and the old black stumps from the 1978 fire. Some of the burned snags still stood amongst the newer trees, tall and skeletal, their bark long gone, their trunks silver grey in fading light, but they almost look human if you saw them from the corner of your eye. A burned forest is full of shapes like that. It trains your imagination badly. Caleb stopped twice to smell the air. This is the first time he said nothing. The second time, he looks back and down the trail and frowns. You smell that? He said. I did. Smoke, but not much. Not the thick, bitter smell of an active wildfire. It was faint and stale, more like the smell left in clothes after standing near a campfire the night before. Beneath it was something else I didn't figure out immediately. Something oily and unpleasant. Old burn, I said. Maybe, Caleb said, but he doesn't sound convinced. We kept going. The sun dropped lower, and the light between the trees turned red. That was when we found the first strange mark. It was a dry patch of trail where dust had settled thickly between exposed roots. At first I thought it was a boot print, then I saw a print, and then nothing I recognized at all. Caleb crouches beside it and angles his flashlight, though it was not fully dark yet. The mark was long and narrow, and presses deep into the dust with 5 thin lines at the end. A foot. Bare maybe, but not too long. The toes were stretched out like somebody had dragged through the ash. Caleb touches the edge of the print with a gloved finger. The dust smeared. That's not dirt, he said. He rubs it between his fingers and says ash. The print was made of ash. We photograph it, mark the GPS location and continue. We didn't talk about it much. There were expectations, if you wanted them badly enough. A barefoot hiker with soot on his feet, a prank. A partial animal track distorted in the dust. Search team survived by accepting possible explanations until possible ones come over the corner. 20 minutes later, the trail forks near the old signpost that had been burned black on one side decades ago. The official route continued east along the ridge, but Nathan's phone ping placed him lower, down in the bowl. There was no mainland path that way, only a faint game trail dropping between the trees. Caleb found a broken branch at shoulder height and then another. Somebody had pushed through recently. We followed. The slope steepens quickly. Dry needles slid under boots. The air grew warmer in drainage, though the sun was almost gone. Not exactly hot, but close breathlessness, as if the bowl held the day's heat and didn't release it. The smoke smell strengthens. My eyes begin to sting. We find Nathan's first marker. It was a strip of bright orange tied around a low branch, part of the rain cover, maybe, or a torn piece from his pack. People who knew that they're lost sometimes do that. They mark their movement, they leave signs for searchers. This is one of the small rational acts that can keep panic from swallowing somebody whole. Below the fabric, written in the ash across a flat stone, are 3 words. Not the fire. Caleb stared at it for a long time. Could he have written that? I asked. He didn't answer, but he took a photo, then bent over without touching the stone. The letters had been drawn with a finger. Each stroke was thick and dark. The ash clumped tightly where moisture from skin had mixed with it. Whoever's wrote this had actually pressed hard enough to leave clean edges. I looked around the drainage. The trees seemed closer together down there. The old burned snags rose around them like black ribs. The air was so still that the smoke didn't drift. It simply hung between the trunks in grey vow. Caleb keyed his radio and called our position. Static after he answered, then dispatch came through. He reported signs that Nathan had left the trail and possible evidence of disorientation. He didn't mention other words. Not yet. We descended another 100 yards maybe and found the second marker. This one was not fabric. It was a trekking pole planted upright in the ground. Its handle melted into a rat black shape. The aluminium shape was actually scorched, but not destroyed, and around its base the pine needles had been burned in an imperfect circle maybe 3 feet wide. Caleb went very still. What? I said. He pointed to the ground. The burnt circle had no pattern, no spread pattern, no feathered edges, no creeping line into nearby needles, no signs of the flame moving outwards. It looked as if a round column of heat had came straight down from above, burned only to that circle and then vanished. That doesn't happen, he said. I waited for him to add some technical explanation, but he does not. A sound came from further down the slope, Not a scream, not a voice, but a sound, a crackling, fire. Caleb and I look at each other, and in that instant, all the strangeness had to step aside for something more immediate. If there was active flame below in that bowl, we need to know its size, direction, and fuel. We move faster, angling towards the sound through the brush that tore at our sleeves and dead branches that snapped underfoot like bones. The glow appeared there before the flames did. At first, it was just a pulse of orange between trees, low and flickering. Then the slope opened into a shallow hollow surrounded by old burnt trunks, and we saw the fire. It was small. That was the first thing that felt wrong. After all the smoke, after Nathan's call, after the smell and the marks of the strange heat and drainage, I expected a spreading ground fire at least, or a cluster of burning brush. Instead, it was a single patch of flame in the centre of the hollow, no bigger than a campfire, burning in a ring of black soil. It gave off almost no smoke. The flame rose straight up, despite the slight wind that had begun moving through the trees above us. And inside the flame stood a man. For one impossible second, my mind refuses to understand what I'm seeing. The flame was upright in the centre of the fire, shoulders squared, head tilted down, arms hanging at the sides. The flames moved around him, lighting the edge of his body orange. His clothes burned away. His skin appears blackened around the edge. But he was standing, not screaming, not staggering. "Nathan," we shout. The figure tilted its head. It wasn't Nathan. I knew that immediately, though I'd only seen one photo of Nathan. Nathan was younger, broader, clean-shaven. The man in the fire looked older, with a narrow face and dark hollows where his eyes should have been, catching the light. His mouth slung open slightly as he turned around. Sparks rose from his shoulder. Then the fire went out, not gradually, not as if he had burned down. It simply vanished. 1 second there were flames. The next there was only the black and orange ground below. The man was gone. Caleb raised his flashlight. The beam found empty soil, charred roots, and a ring of ash, but nothing else. No body, no footprints leading away. No smoke rising from burning clothing. The hollow was silent except for our breathing. I remembered thinking very clearly that this is a moment we should leave. Not retreat and regroup, but leave. We walk uphill, radio command, and let daylight and more people, and maybe 10 different agencies deal with whatever we've just seen. Search and rescue work is built on risk, but there's a difference between risk and warning. That hollow felt like a warning written in a language other than fear. Now, then somebody coughed from behind the trees. A real cough, a wet, painful human one. Nathan? And then we hear help. It came from the far side of the hollow, down towards the creek bed. We crossed the burned circle carefully. The ground inside it was warm through my boots. Not enough to burn, but warm in a way that made my stomach twist. Caleb knelt briefly and touches the soil with the back of his glove. It's too warm for the size of that fire. Then from the distance we hear, "Please, I'm here." This time it sounded more like the man from the file photo, younger, hoarse and terrified. We found Nathan Brooks wedged between two fallen logs about 40 yards below the hollow. He's alive but barely. His face was streaked with soot and tears, his lips are cracked. His other leg is actually trapped between a log. Now, his hands were covered in ash up to the wrist, and his fingernails were split from clawing at bark and dirt. He looked at us with wild, unfocused expressions of somebody who had been alone for too long without explanation. We then call out his name and he begins to cry. Now, not loudly, he didn't seem to have the strength to. The tears just came, cut in plain lines through soot of his face. He grabbed my sleeve and said, "Do not let them stand up again." I told him that he's safe because that's what you say. I told him what we had. I told him help was coming. But my eyes kept moving forwards towards the trees around us, searching for the orange light, searching for movement, searching for a person-shaped shadow standing too still. Caleb assessed the trapped ankle while I checked Nathan's breathing and pulse. He had mild smoke inhalation, dehydration, shock, and a likely fracture. His clothes smelled strongly of smoke, but they're not burned. That struck me as wrong. given where he'd claimed to have come from what we've seen. His boots, however, were coated with fine grey ash, even though the ground around him was mostly pine and dirt. I tell him what happened and he shook his head and said it wasn't spreading. He said the fire, it was following me. Caleb looked up from him and down to his ankle. Nathan swallowed painfully. I saw smoke from the ridge. I went down to check it out. I thought maybe somebody started an illegal campfire, but when I got close it moved. I thought he meant the fire spread, then he said like it saw me. The radio on Caleb's shoulder crackled between a few responses. Dispatch comes through in fragments. We give the location, reported that we found him alive with a leg injury, and requested a carry-out team. The signal cut in and out, but enough got through. The supervisor confirmed that a team would move towards us from the north route. Estimated arrival was at least 90 minutes because of the terrain and darkness. 90 minutes did not sound long enough until I looked at the trees. We prepared Nathan for evacuation the best we could. Caleb then splintered the ankle. I gave him water in small careful sips. His hands would not stop shaking. Every few seconds, he turned his head to look upslope and towards a hollow. I then said, "Who have you seen in the fire?" He said, "At first I thought they were burnt trees. The old ones, the snags, but then one turned around." Caleb kept working, but his jaw tightened. Nathan said there were 6 of them when he first saw the fire, maybe 7, standing in a line beyond the flames, not inside them. He thought they were people, maybe a crew, maybe campers, maybe other hikers watching something burn. He called out to them, but nobody answered. Then the flames flared, bright and sudden, and he saw the figures that were not beyond the fire at all, but were in it. The legs are surrounded by flames, their clothes smoked, their heads were bowed as if they were praying. He ran then, anybody would, but the fire appeared again, lower down the drainage, and then behind him, to his left, not spreading but appearing. Small circles of flame, each one with figures inside, each one going dark when he got too close or too far away. He said they never chased him, not exactly. They waited where he was going, and as if the forest itself was setting lanterns along the path and it chose to go for him. I thought they were trying to lead me out, he said, and then I realized they were leading me down. That was when he fell between the logs and trapped his ankle. He tried to set himself free for hours. At some point after dark, the fire appeared in the hollow above him. One figure stood inside it, watching. Nathan said that it looks like a young man, but not a living man, more like a person who's been burned and then remembered incorrectly. He pointed at Caleb with one trembling finger and said, "It had a jacket like yours." "A fire jacket?" "No, ranger jacket." "Did it have a name on the badge?" "Voss," he said, and I felt something cold and heavy across my chest. Caleb's face went blank. He stood there and turned around towards the hollow. His flashlight beam lifted through the trees, catching trunks, branches, and drifting ash. He didn't say anything, but I thought he was thinking. I knew that. His father actually died in the ridge in 1978 in a fire. Everybody in the district knew that. Martin Voss, seasonal ranger and volunteer firefighter, caught with 3 others when the wind shifted in our old bowl. They had deployed shelters, but the fire overran them. Caleb had been a child then. It was one of the stories that passed quietly through the ranger stations, not like gossip, but more like a warning. I never connected that old burn scar with Caleb's family until that moment. Nathan seemed to understand that. He said something terrible and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know." Caleb crouched and tightened the splint with control, saying, "You're hallucinating." Nathan didn't argue. That was worse somehow. He only stared into the dark slope above and said, "I hope so." So we began doing the carry-out before the search team arrived because staying felt impossible. Caleb and I used a soft litter from my pack. Awkward and slow with only 2 rescuers, but better than waiting beside those logs with the hollow watching us from above. We moved in short sections, lifting Nathan over deadfall, sliding him carefully across steep patches, stepping often, but stopping because the pain gets pretty much for him. Now, the whole time there's no fire anywhere. Still ash fell. It collected on Nathan's jacket. It speckled Caleb's shoulders. It landed on my tongue when I breathed through my mouth, bitter and dry. I looked up more than once, expecting to see smoke overhead, but the sky between the branches was clear and dark. About halfway back to the hollow, Nathan grabbed my wrist. "Stop," he whispered. "What?" Caleb said. "Listen." At first, I only heard the ordinary sounds of the forest, wind and branches creaking, the distant rush of water somewhere below. Then beneath that, a calm, strange rhythmic sound, chopping. Not an axe, way too soft. This was like a shovel, a metallic sound biting dirt. A scrape, a lift, scatter, scrape, so on. Caleb's face changed in a way that I've not seen before. His eyes moved towards the hollow, and I knew he heard it too. This time the sound came from upslope, where the fire had been. "Now, could be the team," I whispered. "No, they're northeast of us, not there." The shoveling continued and I stayed patient. Nathan began breathing fast. "They did that before." "Who did?" "The burned ones, they were digging," he said. No one wanted to ask why they were digging. We had no choice but to continue upwards because the train forces us there. The hollow lay between us and the easiest route back to the old trail. Going around it in the dark with an injured patient would have been too long and put us on steeper ground. Caleb knew that, I knew that, and Nathan knew it too. I felt him trembling through the litter straps as we moved. The shoveling stopped as soon as we reached the edge of the hollow. A headlamp swept across the clearing. The burned circle was there, blacker than the ground around it, but no flames, no figures and no shovel, no fresh hole. Then Caleb's light caught something at the base of the burned snag, a burned name badge. It was old brass, blackened at the edges. Caleb walked towards it before I could stop. He picked it up, felt it, wiped the ash off. Voss. Not Caleb's badge, that was on his chest, newer and cleaner, differently shaped. This one's from an older uniform. Caleb held it in his palm like it weighed more than it should have. His face gone pale in the headlamp glow. "That's impossible," he said. I looked past him into the hollow, expecting to see another figure standing by the fire, or another hand pushing up through the dirt, or something so clearly unnatural that the choice to run would be simple, but there was nothing moving in the ash. The hollow was still. The little circle of burned ground sat there in the middle of the clearing, blackened at the edge, with faint red heat buried in the soil like the last glow of a dead cigarette. Caleb crouched beside the old brass badge, holding it flat in his glove. And for the first time I've seen ever since knowing him, he appears lost. I asked him what was impossible, though I already had a terrible feeling I knew. He turns the badge towards me, and I saw the name stamped beneath, Voss. It was not his. His was literally pinned to his shirt. So we knew that this had been there decades ago. Now, Caleb didn't speak for several seconds. My father's badge was never recovered. The words were quiet, almost swallowed by the dark trees around us. Behind us, Nathan Brooks made a small wounded sound from the litter, not because of his ankle, but because he understood the meaning of it. We were standing in the old Cinderidge, burn scar, in the same stretch of forest where Caleb's father and 3 other men died in 1978 in the fire. A missing hiker had claimed to see people standing inside the flames. We found a small fire that burned without spreading. We seen a man-shaped figure in it. Now, Caleb was holding a badge that should have been buried in history. The rational part of my mind tried to work quickly. Maybe erosion had exposed it. Maybe an animal had dragged it from somewhere higher up to the slope. Maybe an old piece of equipment had been left there and only now come loose after rain and shifting soil. Maybe Caleb was mistaken about it being never recovered. Families remember trauma in strange ways. Records get lost, stories change. There were possible explanations, and I wanted one of them badly enough that I could almost fear myself reaching for it. "That was on him," Nathan whispered. None of us answered. Nathan's face was pale under the soot. His eyes were wild and wet in the beam of my headlamp. He lifted one shaking hand and pointed towards the badge. That man in the fire, he had that on his chest. Caleb closed his fist around the badge now. For a moment, he looked like he might tell Nathan to be quiet, not out of cruelty, but because there are certain things that people cannot bear to hear from strangers. Instead, he put the badge carefully into the evidence pouch and sealed it, and slid it into his chest pocket. He now moves with the rigid control of somebody who was one wrong thought away from coming apart. "Let's keep moving," he said. That was the right decision. It was the only decision. Nathan's ankle was broken or close to it, the temperature's dropping, the smoke was hanging from the drainage, and we had already lost so much light. The carry-out team was still at least an hour away, maybe more if the train slows them down. Staying in that hollow would not help Nathan. It would not explain the badge. Explanations could wait, survival could not. He lifted the litter again and begins working our way down towards the old trail. It was brutal going. The ground was loose, layered with pine needle and ash, and dry soil. We slide under every step. Nathan was trying his best not to cry out in pain, but it come through his teeth sometimes. Caleb took the front, moving with the automatic strength of somebody who was forcing himself back into procedure. I took the rear, watching Nathan's face and the trees behind us whenever I can. For the next few minutes, nothing happened, and that almost makes it worse. The forest returned to its ordinary night sounds, a branch creaking where the sounds high above, a small animal moving in the brush, wind touching the top of trees but barely ever reaching us in the bowl. The strange little fire behind us did not come back. No figures appeared, no voices called. If somebody had walked into the scene right then, they would only have seen two exhausted rangers carrying an injured hiker through an old burned scar, exactly the kind of hard but ordinary rescue that happens all the time in a place like this every year. Then the ash started falling again. At first I thought it was dusk shaken loose from the trees. It drifted down in fine grey speckles, catching us in our headlamps, and then disappearing against the dark ground. I looked up, expecting to see smoke above us, but the canopy was clear enough to show a few faint stars through the branches. There was no glow overhead, no column, no active crown fire. Still, ash touches my cheeks, lips, and the back of my gloves. When I breathed in, I taste bitterness. Caleb notices this too. He stopped and looked upwards. "Can ash drift from old burn?" "Not like this," he said. He did not need to say anything else, and that frightened me more than a dramatic answer would have. Caleb knew fire. If he did not have an explanation, then either there was one that he didn't like, or there was none he could trust. Nathan's breathing continued beneath us. He'd actually gone still from everything and looked from tree to tree without really saying much before he said, "I did this before." I say, "What do you mean?" He said, "The ash. Before the fire, it showed up." Caleb started walking again. We climbed faster after that. With every bit of extra effort, we had more speed. My shoulders burned. My hands cramped around the litter straps. Sweat ran under my collar, then dried almost immediately in the warm, smoky air. The slope seemed longer than it should have, but not in a supernatural way, not like the forest was changing shape now, just like bad terrain in the dark with an injured man between us and fear at our backs. That was enough. After maybe 10 minutes, we saw light ahead. Not fire, white lights, headlamps. I felt relief hit me so hard that I nearly stumbled. Human voices followed, yes, faint but real, calling our unit numbers somewhere from above the slopes. Caleb shouted back. I keyed my radio and got a burst of static, then a broken response from my team too, saying that they had visual on our lights and were coming down. For a few seconds, the whole nightmare loosens its grip. More people were close, more radios and more hands and more witnesses. Then Nathan grabbed the side of the litter and said, "Those aren't them." I almost snapped at him. I wanted to tell him to stop and let us do our jobs, but I suddenly realized that something in his voice stopped me. It wasn't panic exactly, it was recognition. The headlights above us bobbled between the trees and the tree light, maybe four spaced out evenly. They moved slowly downslope. crossing between trunks, vanishing and reappearing. At first they looked exactly like searchers picking their way through the rough ground, but then I noticed they are too low. Not head height, chest maybe, then knee height, then higher again. Caleb stopped. I listened for voices. There were none now. The lights continued moving, burned and snagging above us. Caleb lifted his radio, called Team 2 again. This time the response came through clearly enough for us to understand. "We're holding above the drainage," the team leader said. "We have your position southeast of us. Do you have eyes on it? Or us?" Caleb looked at the lights ahead. They were directly uphill, no more than maybe 70 yards away. "Yeah," he answered. "I have lights below your position." There was a pause, and then the team leader said, "Negative. We're all stationary. All lights are off except lead." The lights that are in front of us all stopped now. My stomach turned. For several seconds, the forest was completely still, and the lights hung there between the trees, not moving or swaying, not behaving like headlamps attached to living people. Then one of them lowered slowly to the ground, another followed, and then dipped behind a fallen log and vanished. It looked like people were crouching, or like small fires were being covered. "Back," Caleb whispered. We stepped back after with the litter, slow and careful. The lights didn't follow. They remained where they were, faint and low, half hidden by the brush. Now, then the smell reaches us. Not smoke this time, not exactly. We get the smell of wet soot, hot metal, and something organic burned not long ago. Nathan began to shake so violently that the litter creaked. The real Team 2 reaches us from the northeast side maybe 7 minutes later. There were 5 of them, not 4, all with proper headlamps, helmets, packs, and the beautiful ordinary clatter of human equipment. I could have hugged all of them. I took one look at Nathan, and he looks over at them, and all of our faces drop into rescue mode without asking questions. More hands changing everything. Nathan was transferred to a better litter. His vitals are checked again. The team medic gave him oxygen and wrapped him in an emergency blanket. The team leader asked Caleb for a sit rep, and Caleb gave him the clean version. Injured subject located below old burn scar. Possible smoke exposure, unknown heat sources in the area, poor visibility, requested an evacuation. It was all true, just not enough. The strange lights were gone by the time I looked back. With the full team, we were able to move Nathan uphill towards the trail. The route took us around the hollow instead of through it, which helps everybody pretend that we're making normal decisions for normal reasons. Nobody wanted to cut straight across that clearing. Nobody said so. The team moved with professional focus, boots digging into the slope, hands passing commands down the line. Lift, hold, step, watch and breathe. Again, lower. For almost 20 minutes, the rescue becomes ordinary, until one of the searchers said, "Do you smell that?" Nobody answered because everybody does. Smoke, and fresh this time. Caleb turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. The wind had shifted. I could feel it now against my face. A faint warm push from below. The smoke came from within thin layers, low to the ground, sliding through the brush and along the trunks. It was not thick enough to blind us, but it changes a forest. It made the beams of our headlamps visible, turning every ray of light into a tunnel. It softened edges, made dead snags appear and disappear as we moved. The team leader called dispatch and reported smoke in the drainage. The forestry was already altered. A second team was held back from entering the lower terrain. Weather was checked, wind speed, humidity, temperature, all the numbers people used to make fire predictable. But while the radio traffic continued, I watched the smoke move through the trees and felt a glow of certainty that the numbers didn't matter. The smoke was not rising. It was not moving uphill in thin fingers. It was close to the ground. It was almost searching. One of the rescuers coughed and asked if anybody had eyes on the flame, but nobody did. We pushed even harder now. The trail was close. Once we reached it, the evacuation becomes faster. The route widened, footing improved, and there would be enough room for anything to get through there. The thought of the opening became kind of like a prayer. I kept my eyes on Caleb's back and Nathan's pale face in the blanket underneath wrapped in foil. Nathan was staring past me. I looked over my shoulder. Behind us, between the trees, an orange glow appeared. It was low to the ground but the size of a campfire. Then another appeared, and then another. Not spreading, not racing like jet fuel, just appearing in separate places, each one containing a glow in the dark, like lanterns being uncovered one at a time. One of the rescuers saw them too, but the line had flattened. Someone swore. The team leader told everybody to keep moving, and we did. I did not turn around. I just kept moving, and eventually we make it back to the base and get Nathan the help that he needs. I was absolutely exhausted. I didn't know what to think of what had happened. I decided that I need to just log off and just try and forget about everything. Now, I eventually make it home that day and collapsed into my bed, and I could have sworn that while I fell asleep, I heard something, the sound of ash and the sound of fire. I opened my eyes and quickly darted around, but there was nothing there. Since that old fateful day, nothing weird ever happened since. Everything else seemed completely normal, and it was. Just a memory of that day. What happened, what all of us saw and experienced, I just can't get it out of my head.